Hello, my name is Dr. Susan Robbins, and the class is Drugs in Society. Hello, class. Say hello to the home viewers and wave. Hello. Okay. Today we're going to be continuing the lecture from last time. Did everybody hold down the microphone when you said hello? Yes? Okay. You've got to remember, what do we do in this class? We hold the mic. Okay, I'm going to be doing a lot of sitting here today because this is a PowerPoint intensive lecture. I'm going to be getting up and standing also, but because we don't have a work-study student to follow me with the camera, I'm going to be sitting more, which I don't like to do, but that's how the way this lecture is going to go. Okay, to the PowerPoint, John. If you remember last week we talked about all the motivations, the various motivations about why people use drugs. Do you remember that? And we came up with a whole list of them. And while that whole list is very valid and it's really important to understand, very important to understand, because the thinking today is that at least in part, I want you to listen to these words, at least in part, drug abuse and drug addiction is a disorder, has with it the component of a disorder of motivation. Let me repeat that. Disorder of motivation. Therefore, motivations are really important. What do we mean by disorder of motivation? People aren't motivated to quit using. Do you see how when we put it into medical terms, all of a sudden it sounds like it belongs in the realm of science? Disorder of motivation. When people like the drugs that they're using, they don't have the motivation to quit. So despite the fact that we talked about many different reasons about why people use drugs, there is one reason that counts more than others, and that is what you see here. The one thing that's primary is that people use drugs because they like the way the drugs make them feel. If they didn't like the way the drugs make them feel, they wouldn't continue to do the drugs unless they were addicted and going through withdrawal and trying to stave off the withdrawal. But the initial process of addiction, when it occurs, and it doesn't always occur, the initial process of addiction occurs because people like the various drugs that they take. And I know we talked last week about how people have different drug preferences. The majority of people have different drug preferences. So this is the primary motivation. The primary motivation. Okay, John, you can go back to me and I will tell you when to go back to the PowerPoint. We actually know a lot about the various drugs of abuse. And we know a lot about them because of rat studies, laboratory animal studies. Again, I told you last week we're not going to talk about animal rights. One of the things that they do when they're testing drugs, any new drug, is that they do experiments on laboratory animals first before they ever do experiments on humans. And we actually know a lot about the drugs that people tend to abuse because of what I'm going to call the rat studies. Obviously, it's not always done on rats. They then move to primates before they move to people. You're following that? But it's always laboratory animals, so I'm just going to talk about it as being rat studies. What the rat studies tell us, and this is really important, is that there are some drugs that rats will self-administer. That's an important concept. There are some drugs that rats will self-administer, and not surprisingly, by and large, these are the same drugs, not all of them, but most of them, guess what, are the very same drugs that people like to use. Why is that an important concept? Why is it important to know what drugs rats would like? Any ideas? None? Okay, Matt, take a stab at it.
Well, I think it goes to the question of like motivation, like on a very basic level, on an animal level. If it's something we think of like animals motivated by food, the requirements to eat, the basic requirements just to sustain life. And if we see those same intentions borne out in terms of using a substance that is not necessary to sustain life, then we can see why it's such a draw for people too.
Absolutely. You've got to figure it this way. We're talking about laboratory animals, right? Rats, they don't come from poverty conditions. They don't come from overcrowded housing. They don't have inadequate job opportunities. They haven't been sexually abused as children. You're following that? Therefore, all of those things that give people, that's an important concept though, All of those things that give people the motivations to use drugs are irrelevant for the rats. For God's sakes, they're just laboratory animals. And therefore, what that tells us about the drugs, and this is why it is so important, is that there are certain drugs that have such a powerfully reinforcing effect in the brain that even rats who don't have all the stressors that humans do, even rats will self-administer these drugs. So therefore, what that tells us is that it is not only a property of the people who use the drugs, but very definitely also a property of the drugs themselves. Does that make sense to y'all? By the way, there are also drugs that rats will not go near. There are some drugs that they initially will not go near, they won't self-administer, but you can train them to do that. Other drugs that they will not go near at all. There's no way you could train them. And not surprising, we're going to talk about all these drugs today. These are the very same drugs that people don't want to use either. Some of the drugs that we use in psychiatry that we call people medication non-compliant when they don't want to take them. And what that tells us is something very important too, that there are certain drugs that have such an adverse effect on the brain that if rats don't like these drugs and won't go near them, for the most part, you can bet that people won't either. Does that make sense to y'all? Now, I want to balance this always, because right now we're talking about what the drug does to the brain. What the drug does to the brain. However, we know that with humans, it's not only, and that's the biological component, right? The neurobiological component. With people, there are not only the neurobiological components of what the drug does, but there are all of those various environmental factors that go into drug use too. So what I want to get across in this class, we talked about this last week, is that biopsychosocial perspective. That at some points, like today, we're going to be talking a lot about biology, the biology of what these drugs do. In other words, what are the effects pretty much across the spectrum with most of these drugs for most people. And that's essentially what the drug does to the body. You following that? In addition to that, we also have lots of psychological motivations. We're going to talk today about one drug has a psychogenic, and I will describe that motivation. And in addition to that, we also have all kinds of environmental factors that go into drug use. So while I'm saying there are certain drugs that are so rewarding that is no surprise that people like it because rats like these same drugs, just remember that people are not as simplistic as rats. At least I hope we're not. I could be wrong. Okay. So let's take a look. What I'm going to do first is go through the list. Back to the PowerPoint. I'm going to go through the list of which are the drugs that rats will self-administer. Which are the ones that they really don't like particularly, but you can probably train them to self-administer them. And then we're going to take a look at the drugs that they won't go near. And then we will describe each of these drugs and what they do. Okay? We have a class of drugs that we're going to call central nervous system depressants. Anything that is a CNS depressant, all of these drugs, by the way, work on the central nervous system. In your readings, you should have encountered that, yes? Okay, and what happens? It slows down your breathing, it slows down your heartbeat, it slows down everything in the central nervous system. Okay. Rats love alcohol. And guess what? People do too, yes. You've got to use the microphone instead of just shaking your head. Okay. Rats love alcohol. It's a CNS depressant. Of all the drugs we're going to be talking about today, it is probably one of the more complex drugs in the way it works in the body and the brain, because it affects many different neurotransmission systems, and we probably have less of an understanding of alcohol than we do of the other drugs. Another drug that rats love, they love barbiturates and benzodiazepines. These are the drugs, barbiturates particularly used for sleep. It's the older generation. We're going to be talking about those today. Benzodiazepines are the Valium-type drugs, the drugs that are chemically related to Valium. So we call them benzodiazepines or benzos. And these are the drugs that are called hypnotics and sedatives. Hypnotics and sedatives. And we're going to talk about the effects of these drugs. Rats like these drugs, and people like these drugs. Rats always also like all of the opiates. I have two words up here, opiates and opioids. Opiate refers to, and we're going to talk more in more detail about this, any drug that is derived from the opium poppy. Opioids are the synthetic, actually opioids refers to the entire class of drugs, but it also includes the synthetic drugs like Demerol. I just wanted you to be clear about what those two words mean. They mean similar things, and very often people use the term opiates for the entire class of drugs, including the synthetics, and that's not technically correct. Of all the drugs that we're going to be talking about today, remember we talked about drug combinations last week? The most dangerous drug combinations that people can take are these, any of these with any of the others of these. Because what happens is that if one drug suppresses the CNS system or depresses it, you add another CNS depressant to it, what you get is something called a supra-additive effect. In other words, it's not like 1 + 1 = 2, it's more like 4 × 4. So they potentiate each other in such a way that it can cause serious problems, if not death. Is anybody in here old enough to remember the name Karen Ann Quinlan? No. I'm asking for a reason. You folks are all too young for this. She became very, very famous. It's the first time, I think, that we fully realized the extent of how dangerous combining these drugs could be. It was a young woman who was taking, I believe, prescription Quaalude. It's a sedative hypnotic drug that was very abused. They don't no longer make it. It's off the market now. She was taking Quaaludes, and she was drinking at the same time, and ended up in a coma and in a total vegetative state, just from combining one with the other. The reason that she became so famous is that it became probably the first widely known case about whether or not we take this woman off life support. Brain dead, no question brain dead, absolutely positively brain dead for year after year after year. And that's what started part of the debates about what do we do with people that are not just in a coma, but legally declared brain dead. They left her on the life supports, and I believe she eventually died many years later. The reason that I stop and talk about this when I talk about these drugs also is that remember we talked about some concepts last week, and we're going to expand that this week. We talked about what happens when people become tolerant to a drug. Do you remember what tolerance is? What is it? What did we say it was? Because we're going to be talking about those terms again today. Yeah, over here. Christina? No? Okay, Matt. To you, Matt.
Okay. Tolerance develops with most drugs, but that's where the effect, the primary effect that people use the drugs for, that effect, it diminishes over time. It doesn't necessarily, and actually often does not diminish the actual physical toll on your body, but the pleasurable effects of those substances diminish over time when you increase your tolerance.
And depending on the drug, we talked about this, yes, you're right. What happens is you need more of the drug to get the same effect that you used to get from a lesser effect. And tolerance is variable. Some drugs have quick tolerance. Some drugs have slow tolerance. But all of the drugs that we're going to be talking about today, if there is physical dependence, which we're coming to in a minute, associated with them, if there's physical dependence associated with them, what you're going to find first is increasing tolerance. So of all the drugs of abuse, all of the drugs of abuse that we're going to be talking about today, what you see before you see drug dependence, physical dependence, and I'm going to define that in a second, what you see before you see that is increasing tolerance, that they have to take more and more and more and more. Now, the same way that tolerance is a variable concept, it's not the same for all drugs. Not all drugs cause the same kind of physical dependence. So let me talk about physical dependence, and then we're going to go back to taking a look at these drugs. Physical dependence occurs when the body adapts to the presence of the drug. Adapts to the presence of the drug. And essentially what happens, and it's different for different drugs, is that when people are using drugs all of the time. When they're using drugs all the time, and the body and the brain have now adapted to the presence of the drug, they become more and more tolerant. They need higher and higher doses. At a certain point, the body's own neurotransmitters stop regenerating themselves. I think we talked about this last week, didn't we? That the brain is smart, the brain is stupid. Well, the brain mistakes the drug for the body's own neurotransmitter. And it says to itself, oh, I've got plenty of this here. I don't need to replenish it. Because what happens with normal neurotransmission is that it's constantly replenishing itself. When people are using drugs sporadically, it doesn't interfere with that tremendously. But when people are using drugs regularly, the body then adapts to the presence of the drug. Its own neurotransmission shuts down over time. It doesn't happen overnight. And the other thing that happens is that the receptors cut back. Because there's so much of the drug flooding the brain, you're following this, that the brain says to itself, well, I don't need any more of my own neurotransmitter because it's mistaking the drug for the neurotransmitter. And it also says to itself, well, I don't need all these receptors because there's so much of this. I need very few receptors. We talked about the elasticity or plasticity of the brain last time. Remember that? That's what I mean, that the drug adapts to the condition, the brain adapts to the conditions there. So when somebody becomes physically dependent, how do we know it? What happens? Again, let's try Eric.
They'll exhibit withdrawal symptoms.
Okay, exactly. They will exhibit withdrawal symptoms or withdrawal syndrome. Does anybody know what withdrawal syndrome looks like? Full-blown withdrawal syndrome. Matt?
Well, I mean, you can have a whole range of behaviors. People can be really sweaty, clammy, seizures, nausea, vomiting. I mean, it just basically the whole. It seems like a lot of different bodily functions get completely out of whack. Whether constipation or going to diarrhea or just very uncomfortable, unpleasant, and can sometimes kill people.
And that's why we're talking about that, because with certain drugs it can sometimes kill people. Generally speaking, I don't make a distinction between what they call psychological dependence and physical dependence, except that there are certain drugs that can kill people if they try quitting on their own, if their body is already physically dependent. And that's why the concept of physical dependence is so terribly important. You all following this? And we're going to talk about which those drugs are. Essentially, what you've given is a lot of the symptoms. Now, I don't want to bring back bad memories, okay? But I want you to think about, and this is probably not the right year to be talking about this, the last time you ever had the flu. Well, withdrawal, what full-blown withdrawal syndrome looks like, think about the flu, the worst flu you've ever had, and multiply that times 10 or 20. So the symptoms that Matt was talking about, what you get is shaking. You get hot sweats, cold, hot, cold. You start vomiting everything up, and when there's nothing left in your stomach, you start dry heaving. You start shaking. You're in pain. It is a horrible, horrible physiological withdrawal from the drug not being in the system. But it's not only that the drug is not in your system, because the brain has cut back on its own neurotransmission in reaction to the presence of the drug. What you're left with is not only the drug being out of the system, but the neurotransmitters temporarily being out of whack. You all following that? And therefore, you get this very, very sick withdrawal with certain drugs. Certain drugs, not all drugs. So let's go back to the PowerPoint for a minute. Okay, all of those symptoms that we just talked about, that very horrible flu times 20, you get that with alcohol. You get that with barbiturates. To a lesser extent with benzodiazepines, although the shorter-acting benzodiazepines, such as Xanax, which we're going to talk about today, are very, very hard, has a very hard withdrawal. We'll talk a little bit about that. You also get that with the opiates and the opioids. But there's one big difference between alcohol and barbiturates and the opiates, in that you talked about one of the symptoms is that people can, there's one that you mentioned, seizures.
Right.
Seizures can happen with alcohol, withdrawal from alcohol. Seizures can happen with withdrawal from barbiturates. They don't happen with opiates. unless the person has other compromising health factors. So in other words, what I'm trying to tell you here is that if you've got somebody who is alcohol dependent, and again, dependence in this case, alcohol dependence is a physiological adaptation of the body to the drug, so that when the drug is not there, the person gets very, very, very sick. And with alcohol and barbiturates, most likely because they work on GABA receptors and opiates don't, they can actually start having seizures. With alcohol, you can also have hallucinations. You don't tend to get that with opiates. So the real dangerous withdrawal, if somebody is physically or physiologically dependent on a drug, comes from alcohol and barbiturates. To a lesser extent, the benzodiazepines, but the shorter-acting benzodiazepines have high liability for that. And the reason for that is that people start to withdraw from it. They're such short-acting, they automatically go into a withdrawal. It has to do with the short-acting nature. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Opiates and opioids. They feel like they want to die, but they're not going to. Opiates and opioids, they feel like they want to die, but they're not going to. Any questions about that? Okay, again, the reason that I'm separating this out is because when we think about physical dependence, I mean, the bottom line is no matter what the drug is, if it causes physical dependence, and not all drugs do, if it does, then it's always something that is going on in the body and the brain. There are other drugs that you don't get this sick withdrawal from. In fact, you get very minor withdrawal, which we're going to talk about. And part of our, well, I'm going to say what we now know is misinformed thinking. The early thinking about drug dependence is that there are only certain drugs that you can get hooked on. And which drugs were they? The ones that cause the physiological withdrawal. And which ones cause that withdrawal? Only the CNS depressants. Y'all following this? You don't get that sick withdrawal from most of the other drugs. So here's what you need to know about the CNS depressants, which are these drugs up here, is that they all cause very profound physiological dependence. Less so for the benzodiazepines, but the shorter acting ones more so. What else do you need to know? That if you're working with clients who are physically dependent on alcohol or barbiturates or Xanax, they need to be in detox. You cannot and should not tell them to detox on their own or to just quit using on their own, because you could kill them. Removal of a drug when somebody is physically dependent on alcohol or barbiturates could in fact kill them. Opiates are slightly different, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. Somebody withdraws from opiates, again, they get very sick, but they're not going to go have seizures and die. That would be extremely rare. Next thing you need to know about this class of drugs is that the most dangerous drug combinations you could take are these drugs together, because they depress the central nervous system and act in a synergistic way that makes them super additive. So the effects are much, when you put two of them together, they're much more than just two. Any questions about that? Okay. Back to the PowerPoint. Other drugs that rats will self-administer readily. Amphetamines, what a surprise. Including methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is just one of several forms of amphetamine. Amphetamines all work on the same neurotransmitters and receptors. We'll talk a little bit more about this today. One of the problems we're having with methamphetamine now is that it is not being made in a pharmaceutical lab. I take that back. Some of it is, and those are the drugs that we give kids for ADD, ADHD. But the drugs that, when we hear people abusing methamphetamine, what we're seeing is homemade solutions that have all kinds of junk in them. We talked about that last week, about manufacture of the illegal drugs, right? Okay, so when we talk about amphetamines, folks, that includes methamphetamine. It is simply one of the amphetamines. Other drugs, what a surprise. Rats will easily self-administer cocaine, including crack or freebase. What is the difference between cocaine, crack, and freebase? Does anybody know? Matt?
cocaine is powder form, crack is cocaine and other substances mixed together in like a rock form, and freebase, you smoke it. And I don't understand why Richard Pryor blew himself up by freebasing.
Because ether is involved. The use of ether, which is very flammable, is involved in the process of making freebase. I don't know if I brought this with me. Let me take a look. Yes, I did. When we talk about cocaine and crack and freebase, we will talk about that. The reason he blew himself up, there are several reasons. Hang on, when we talk about cocaine, we'll talk about that. The point that I'm trying to make here, these are the CNS stimulants, the very powerful stimulants. And these stimulants act so strongly on the brain, they are extremely reinforcing, extremely so. The biggest difference, does anybody know the difference between cocaine and amphetamines? Try again, Matt.
Well, in terms of, I think, effect, the amphetamines last a lot longer. Cocaine and those substances, it's in and out very quickly, whereas amphetamines can last for hours.
One of the big liabilities of cocaine is the fact that it is such a short-acting drug. Essentially, cocaine and the amphetamines do the same thing. Cocaine acts a little bit more on the dopamine system, but they all work on the same neurotransmitters. And they all have very similar effects, except cocaine is so short-acting that it's in and out of the brain really quickly. Amphetamines are exactly the opposite. They're one of the longer-acting drugs. So essentially, these two drugs are very similar to one another. And therefore, we shouldn't be surprised that rats like these drugs. And guess what? People like these drugs too. There's your list of what rats like. People like other drugs, though, don't they? What's not on this list that people like? Yeah.
Marijuana.
Okay, marijuana. So let's take a look next at, back to the PowerPoint. Oh, what this tells us, by the way, is that these drugs have a very strong reinforcing property in the brain. Extremely, extremely strong reinforcing property. Okay, the drugs that rats will not readily self-administer. This is, I don't know if it's in the same order. Now let's take this one first. The psychedelic drugs. Rats don't like to hallucinate. Do that again, but put down your microphone so everybody can hear you laughing. Rats don't like to hallucinate. Hallucinating is not a state that they would enjoy. Does that make sense to you? And when people take the psychedelic drugs, we're going to talk more about each of these drugs. When people take psychedelic drugs, they take it for that hallucination experience. But you see, psychedelics not only make you hallucinate, they have other effects as well. And we're going to be talking about those effects. So people take psychedelics in a planful way because they want to experience the effects. It's no surprise that rats will not touch these drugs because rats will not go near it because it makes them hallucinate. That makes sense to you? Okay, next drug the rats don't particularly like is marijuana. Why do you think that might be? People like marijuana. In fact, of all the drugs of abuse, other than alcohol and possibly tobacco, nicotine, of the illegal drugs of abuse, it is the most widely used drugs, and yet rats don't like it. Any ideas? Okay, Matt.
I'm just wondering, just because I've seen marijuana classified so many different ways, maybe because of all the different ways it's classified. I mean, at times it's like, well, it's a hallucinogen, and then at times, well, it's a stimulant, and then at times it's like something like this that maybe it just wreaks havoc with the rat's central nervous system. It's like all over the place, and it's just it's not a consistent experience, and so it's uncomfortable for the rat to, you know, be this or be that or be.
It was a good guess, but it's not correct. Well, it was a good guess because you hit on something very important there, though. That at various times we have called marijuana different things. In fact, it's in a class of its own. There is no other drug that does exactly what marijuana does. And the fact that when we try to demonize it, we say all kinds of things about it that are not necessarily true. It's never a stimulant. Never, ever, ever. People might feel intellectually stimulated, but it's not a stimulant. It doesn't have stimulant properties. and it doesn't wreak havoc with the central nervous system. In fact, one of the reasons that rats don't like it is that it does not work on the same receptors and neurotransmitters as the other drugs. In fact, we now know that marijuana has its own set of receptors. And the high that people get from most marijuana, and again, we'll talk more about marijuana today, the high that people get from most marijuana would be equivalent, more or less, to a drink or two. The kind of euphoric high that people get from marijuana is equivalent to having 1 or 2 drinks at most. And what I'm trying to get at is that it has its own set of receptors, and it doesn't work on the most reinforcing receptors. It does have, as we'll talk about today, some pain-killing properties, but it doesn't work directly on dopamine in the way that cocaine and some of the other drugs do. You all following that? And the opiates work on dopamine, but in a very different way. It doesn't work directly on dopamine. It works on cells that are near the dopamine cells. So because it doesn't work quite the same in the central nervous system, it's got its own set of receptors, and we're going to talk more about this, the high is very subjective. So you're right in that people have very different effects, but objectively speaking, it does the same thing physiologically to everybody. Subjectively speaking, there are lots of different effects of marijuana. And most likely the rats cannot appreciate those subjective effects. I'm guessing that the rats are not going to feel creative enough to write a song. Is that a pretty good guess? The kinds of subjective effects, will rats get the munchies? They might get hungry, but they might not. So again, we're going to talk more about marijuana. It has over 200 subjective effects. And because the effects of the reinforcing drugs, of the CNS stimulants and depressants that we've talked about, are so direct in the brain, that's what keeps people going back for more. And marijuana just doesn't work on those receptors. Any other drugs that we haven't mentioned here? There are 2 more that people like. Yeah. Allison.
Nicotine?
Nicotine. Absolutely. Nicotine also has its own set of receptors. And we're going to talk more about nicotine, but it's not a drug. I mean, can you train rats to self-administer nicotine? Sure. But it takes work. They do not simply press the bar. If you go and take a look at the way they do rat studies, they put them in cages, they have them hooked up to the drugs, and they press the bar to get the drug. They simply will not on their own keep going back for more and more nicotine, because again, it's probably such a mild high, and it works on different receptors. And one more that people like a lot. I had it this morning. Caffeine. Everybody using the microphones? Caffeine.
Caffeine.
Also, again, can you train rats to self-administer caffeine? Probably, but not as, they do not gravitate towards it by themselves. Does that make sense? Again, because the high it's not that reinforcing in the brain. Any questions about these? We're gonna cover each of these in great detail, by the way. Okay, so now let's take a look at the drugs that rats, or what this tells us. These drugs do not have very strong reinforcing properties in the brain. But people still like these effects because there is a subjective realm that we have that we're assuming the rats do not have. Okay? Any questions? Okay, let's take a look at drugs that rats don't like, and guess what? People don't like these drugs either. Antipsychotic medications, any and all of them, rats will not go near. And what is the biggest problem that we have in psychiatry? Patient non-compliance on medications. Yes? People who are schizophrenic and are given antipsychotics routinely go off their medications. Why? Because they don't like the way these drugs make them feel. All of the antipsychotics lower the amount of dopamine in the brain, and anything that lowers dopamine, nobody is going to like. People don't like it, rats don't like it. The lowering of dopamine is also what gives people that Parkinsonian shuffle, Because remember, the thing about antipsychotics work in many areas of the brain, not just in the center of the brain to reduce the hallucinations. They also work at the stem of the brain, which controls movement. Which is why when people have Parkinson's disease, they have a decrease in dopamine in the base of their brain. And guess what antipsychotics do? The same thing. It decreases dopamine all over the brain in order to stop the hallucinations, but it also decreases dopamine where we don't need it to. Not surprisingly, the other drug that rats don't like, back to the PowerPoint for a minute, and people don't like, is lithium. What do we see with people who are bipolar and are prescribed lithium? They go on it, they go off of it. Why do they go off of it? Yeah, Matt.
It balances people out, but they're you know, the lows aren't as low and the highs aren't as high, and so it's more of a kind of a plain emotional experience.
The side effects suck though as well.
I'm sorry?
The side effects suck for most people, similar to antipsychotic features.
But it's more than that. That's what I'm trying to get at. We can say that it levels it out and people don't like that level feeling. It actually does things to anything that lowers dopamine, anything that lowers the neurotransmitters that make people feel good is going to be a drug that no person's going to like and no rat is going to like. So you would think, well, what we call the side or the adverse effects. Remember what we said last week? Those are very direct effects. And it's easy to say, well, they don't like it because of the side effects, but it's the effect of what it's doing to them. These drugs leave people not able to think clearly. I don't know how else to put that. Their mental functioning is just simply not as clear. It reduces symptoms. You're right about that, actually. It reduces the symptoms. And there are all kinds of effects that we don't want to happen with lithium, right? Extremely toxic, which is why we have to screen all the time. We have to do blood screenings, yes? Extremely toxic. So what we're doing to treat a mental illness is putting in fairly toxic drugs in some cases. And that's certainly true, not just with the older generation of antipsychotics, but the newer generation. You find all kinds of toxicity associated with it, and people simply don't like the effects. It leaves them unable to function mentally the way in which they would like to. Does that make sense to y'all? So we shouldn't be surprised, and the bottom line is here, that we shouldn't be surprised that if rats don't like these drugs, we shouldn't be surprised that people don't like these drugs either. That makes sense to y'all? Any questions about that? Okay. Let's take these drugs one by one. We're going to talk about what these drugs are and what they do. Alcohol, probably the most widely used and widely abused drug. Where do we find it? What forms? We find it in distilled spirits, beer, wine, and liqueurs. Let's talk about what the primary effects are and what we mean by blood alcohol level or blood alcohol content. The primary effects are that it is a CNS depressant. It slows down your heart, slows down your central nervous system. And we're going to talk next about dose, because the way you determine dose is how many drinks a person has within an hour. How do people usually take alcohol? Just one way, orally. Let's take a look at tolerance. Do people become tolerant to alcohol? Do most of us become tolerant to alcohol? We do? I don't think so. How many of us in here drink? How many of you drink more than 2 or 3 drinks a day? Then you're probably not tolerant. Remember, tolerance is not a yes-no concept. It's a question of how does the drug create tolerance and how frequently do you have to take this drug for tolerance to occur. With alcohol, it's variable. It depends on how much you drink. We can have 2 drinks a day every single day and not become tolerant to alcohol. You following that? So here, let's go back to last week's lecture. We talked about dose, right? So here we have dose. 2 drinks. We're going to take a look at the blood alcohol level when we talk about dose. Every day we have frequency, right? But what don't we have? High dose usage on a daily basis that creates tolerance. You all following that? So tolerance is variable. People who are social drinkers, even regular or moderate drinkers. What do I mean by regular or moderate? Somebody who drinks 1 or 2 drinks a day, every day, is probably not going to become tolerant to alcohol because they're simply not drinking enough of it. As people up their intake and do it more frequently, rather than 1 or 2 glasses a day, they start drinking from the minute they wake up to the minute they go to sleep. They're going to be both tolerant, and if they keep this up, they're going to gain tolerance and they're going to become dependent. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, when we talk about cross-tolerance, very simply, what that means is if a person is tolerant to drug A, are they also tolerant to drug B? Does that make sense? So if you're tolerant to vodka, you're going to be tolerant to beer. If you're tolerant to beer, you're going to be tolerant to wine. If you're tolerant to wine, you're going to be tolerant to gin. You all follow that? Okay. Any questions about that? Okay, now remember, when I talk about dependence, I'm talking about physical dependence. Can people become physically dependent on alcohol? Yes, but it takes a while to get there. It takes heavy drinking. It developed as a result of chronic ingestion of high doses. Chronic ingestion of high doses, not just 1 or 2 drinks a day. Somebody who drinks moderately at 1 or 2 drinks a day, every day, is not going to see any significant tolerance, nor are they going to become dependent, physically dependent. They're simply not drinking enough. As people begin to drink more and more and start spacing their drinks less far apart, we're going to come to this next, the blood alcohol level goes up and they get drunker and drunker. And here's where we could see how we could talk about dose when we talk about alcohol. So physical dependence only happens over a long period of time as a result of chronic ingestion. And what you see is classic, what we just talked about, the classic withdrawal syndrome, where you get those horrible, horrible flu-like symptoms, but you also get with alcohol, if somebody is seriously dependent, you also get hallucinations, delirium tremens, and you could possibly, the person could possibly die. Very significantly, cross-dependence occurs with other CNS-dependent depressants as well. That's an important concept. Come back to me for a minute. Don? It's a very important concept because when we withdraw people from alcohol, what do? We do drug replacement. We do drug replacement so that they don't start having seizures. And we replace it with other drugs that work on GABA receptors. So it is not uncommon in detox centers that we stop the person from drinking, but then we give them another CNS depressant to keep them from going into this horrible, horrible sick withdrawal. So we do a drug substitution, and then we titre that drug down bit by bit by bit. By titering it down, what we're doing is taking that dose and halving it. You're following that? We're either halving it or whatever formula they use. They give them less and less and less and less to avoid them from going into withdrawal. You're following that? Any questions about that? So therefore, that's an important concept. The cross-dependence is to all other CNS depressants. And if we didn't have that, we would have a hard time treating alcohol dependence because we would have a hard time withdrawing somebody on alcohol by halving the alcohol. And yeah, Matt.
I mean, does it make a difference? I mean, I know that people will use substances, but I mean, it's like, okay, fine. I mean, could you help someone detox from alcohol with alcohol? Like, okay, you drink a liter of vodka a day, so tomorrow we're going to cut that in half, and the day after that we're going to cut that in half for a week or 10 days, and then say you're not going to get anything? You
know, I don't know the answer to that. I think the reason that we don't do that is that we have much, first of all, and we're going to talk more about this today, what happens is that when people start to associate behaviorally the taste of the alcohol with the effects, that's what causes what we might call psychological dependence or impaired behavior. Looking for a term here. What we call roughly psychological dependence. You don't want to have those associations between the taste of the alcohol, because what does that do? It sets off a craving for more alcohol. So what we want to do is to take them off alcohol entirely, but yet not do things that will set up the craving, but keep them from going into withdrawal. Does that make sense? Paired behavioral responses, or conditioned responses, that's what I was looking for. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about tobacco. It happens with a lot of drugs, but tobacco is the best example of that. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Let's talk about what we mean by dose, because this is really important. Blood alcohol level, also called blood alcohol content. That's why I say BAL or BAC. Depends on who you're reading, it means the same thing. Essentially, here's how we get dose with alcohol. It refers to the amount of alcohol that is in your bloodstream. See, unlike a pill, we don't have X milligrams. You're following that? Pills, we know what, pills that are made pharmaceutically anyway, we know what the dose is. With alcohol, the way that we can tell dose is the amount of alcohol that is in your bloodstream. So it is, the BAL is more or less a rough measure of the dose that the person has consumed. Very importantly, there are lots of factors that can affect the blood alcohol level. All of us can have the same amount of alcohol to drink and have very different effects. Same amount and the same amount of time. Here are just some of the variables. There are more than this, but some of them are weight, person's body weight, gender. I think I alluded to this last time. Drugs in general and alcohol in particular tend to be harder on women than men. Some of that has to do with the percent of body fat as opposed to muscle. Some of it has to do with hormones and hormone levels. And another factor that can affect the blood alcohol level is tolerance. Because what happens when people become tolerant? They need more of the alcohol, so therefore they might have a higher BAL and be functioning okay. Because they have become so tolerant, not only physically, but also behaviorally to the effects of the drug. Okay. As a general rule, the liver can only metabolize 1 drink per hour. 1 drink per hour, hour and a half, more or less. And therefore, the more you drink in an hour, the higher what happens? You raise your blood alcohol level, right? Any questions about that? So if I had, let's say that I'm a 5, now this is dangerous because it's not healthy for the body, and I don't do this. Back over to me for a second, John. Let's say that I drink 5 drinks a day, which I don't, by the way. It's not healthy. It's going to wreak havoc on your body. But let's say that I did in terms of blood alcohol level. If I had hypothetically a drink at 9 in the morning, then didn't drink again until noon, then had my next drink at 4 or 5, then had my next drink at 7 or 8, and one more drink at 9 or 10, my blood alcohol would not be raised significantly, even though I'm drinking a lot. You all following that? Now that, by the way, is not the way most people who drink 5 drinks a day drink. Everybody's clear about that, right? But I'm talking about hypothetically, because I'm giving my body time to metabolize the alcohol, and therefore my blood alcohol level or content is not going to go up significantly, because it will go up to about maybe a 0.04, 0.05 with the first drink, then it's going to drop back down as the alcohol metabolizes out. Then as I take my second drink, back up to that same only maybe 0.04, 0.05. You're following that? On the other hand, if I sit there, let's say I don't start in the morning. Let's say I start drinking at 5 o'clock at night. And at 5 o'clock, I take a shot of vodka. 10 minutes later, another shot of vodka. 10 minutes later, another shot of vodka or whiskey. I mean, pick your poison. Okay? What's going to happen? Because I'm not giving my liver the opportunity to metabolize the alcohol the blood alcohol level rises and rises and rises with every drink that I have in close proximity time-wise to each other. Is that making sense to you? So when we talk about dose, we're talking about the amount or level of alcohol in the bloodstream. And that is why, by the way, even though technically speaking, 1 glass of wine is equivalent to 1 beer, is equivalent to 1 shot of liquor, they all have the same, pretty much the same amount of alcohol. Yes, there is some variation, but it takes longer to drink a full glass of wine than it does if you're just chugging shots. You all following that? Okay. And I'm not trying to say that it's safe to drink 5 or 6 glasses of wine in a row. Just that it takes longer to do it, and therefore it's easier to get drunker and raise your BAL or BAC with shots than it is with mixed drinks, just simply because there's more volume to consume. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. This is a bad example of a PowerPoint slide. You should never put this many words on a PowerPoint slide. I'm going to put some handouts up on Blackboard for you, which will give you this in a table form that's easier to read. But I just want you to take a look at the concepts here about what happens as blood alcohol level rises with alcohol. If you remember last week, one of the first things I said is dose matters, right? The higher the dose, what happens? The bigger the what? Everybody, effect. The higher the dose, the bigger the effect. Okay, so at a 0.05 blood alcohol level, or BAL, we feel happy, right? What happens? Relaxed. Our inhibitions get lowered slightly. Our judgment gets slightly impaired, not incredibly, but slightly. But essentially, here's somebody who's starting to relax and feel good. As the BAL rises to a 0.08, which is now the limit for driving while intoxicated, what we find is really impaired coordination, more so than at a 0.05. And here we find much more impaired judgment. By the time it gets to a 0.10, which used to be the legal limit for driving, and then they got smart and lowered it, here we have seriously slowed reaction time, increasingly impaired motor function, and people become much less cautious, which is why when people are drinking and they get behind the wheel of a car, it's dangerous because they drive fast and they do stupid things. Because their judgment is impaired, their coordination is impaired, and they become less cautious. By a 0.15, here we see consistent increases in slowed reaction time, clearly impaired balance and movement. Here's where we see people slurring, right? Here's where we see people that are almost stumbling. You could tell, you know how they do the field sobriety tests? They want people to walk a straight line. I don't know if I could do that if I was sober, but certainly not when you're intoxicated, because here's where you lose motor coordination, seriously, and your balance is impaired. By a 0.20, you are clearly and definitely intoxicated. There is no question about that your sensory and motor capability are seriously impaired. So what happens, the more people drink in a short time, the higher the BAL or the BAC goes, and that's like taking increasing doses. By the time you get to a 0.25, here's where people are not just weaving, but they're staggering. They can't even walk. Their sensory perceptions are greatly impaired, and they're very obviously drunk. How many of you have been around drunk people? Most of you, yes? Can you tell when they're drunk? By what? What are some of the things that you see?
They fall down.
They fall down?
Significantly slurred speech. Sometimes people get violent, get very reactive.
Yep. You've got different kinds of drunks. Some people are happy drunks. They're the ones that put the light shade on their head at parties, right? And do silly things. And others are angry drunks. But you can definitely tell that it's the alcohol that is causing this. And yes, they fall down. They can be staggering so much that they cannot even keep their balance. By a 0.30, they're stuporous but conscious. In other words, they're still awake, but they're in a stupor. They have no comprehension of what's external to them, and some of them, in fact, might at this point lose consciousness. A 0.35. Alcohol is a really good painkiller. However, you have to be really drunk for it to kill pain. Here's where you reach the level of surgical anesthesia. LD1. LD means lethal death, and 1 means 1% of the population at a 0.35 will die. That's the minimal amount of alcohol that we need to cause death. I'm going to talk more about an LD50 in a minute. So by 0.35, you've got surgical anesthesia. People are not coherent. Many times they're not even conscious, and they might die. By a 0.40, here we're talking about very, very, very dangerous BAL, because not only do most people lose consciousness at a 0.50, but 50% of people at a 0.50 will die. Now that's a very important concept, an LD50. That means lethal dose 50. Back to me. Back over, yeah. LD50, that's an important concept. I want you to think about this. When pharmaceutical companies are doing drug testing, one of the things that they do is that they test these drugs on animals to see several things. They're looking to see what the drug does at different doses. Because remember, the bigger the dose, the larger the effect, and sometimes very different effects. We could see with alcohol, we've gone from being happy and giddy at lower levels to being stuporous at higher levels. So they're testing for several things. They're testing to see what the effects are at different doses. You keep raising the dose to see what the effects are. The other thing that they're testing for, and again, we're not going to talk about animal rights, is to find out what the LD50 is. That's a very important concept. That's the dose at which 50% of the test animals are going to die. That's important because let's say we have a new drug that we're trying to bring to market, and the dose that it takes to get the effect that we want is 100 milligrams. Again, this is just hypothetical. They've tested it. It doesn't do what, let's say we're looking for an appetite suppressant. Okay, that's a good example. Or a sleeping medication. Let's say sleeping medication. The dose that it takes for most people to go to sleep, hypothetically, let's say 100 milligrams. But let's say, remember, they're not testing this on people first, that when they're testing it on the rats, at 120 milligrams, half the rats die. That's not enough of a margin of safety for that drug to ever come to market. Does that make sense? And that's why knowing what an LD50 is very, very important, particularly as it compares to the effective dose. The effective dose is simply the dose that you need to give most people to get a specific effect that you're looking for. And that effect could be lowering anxiety, it could be putting people to sleep, it could be suppressing appetite. You know, every drug has different effects, and we're looking for different effects. Could be to alleviate depression. Again, the safety margin, if the LD50 is too close to the effective dose, that's going to be a very dangerous drug. Does that make sense to y'all? Okay, Matt, you had a question about the LD50?
Well, I find it really interesting that you can go from 0.35 BAC, where it's LD1, and then in a very short,
yes.
a very short span, you get to the point where half the population will die.
Yes.
That's, especially when you look at the continuum going up too. It's like,
yes.
Mildly like happy, okay, a little slurred speech. It's like consistent, and things are getting more severe, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, half of you are dead.
Yeah, but right before that, people lose consciousness. And you know that when a drug causes somebody to be unconscious, that couldn't be a very good sign. So you're right that the margin is a very small margin, but take a look at all that all goes on leading up to it, because you get more and more and more serious impairment to the point of losing consciousness. And thankfully, we do not have very many overdose deaths from alcohol. Do you know where we find them mostly? Who tends to overdose from drinking too much alcohol? There's one population. Anybody else know? Okay, Matt.
I would assume young people.
Not just any young people,
Young women.
college students. Where do we see? You knew the answer in the back. You're patting yourselves on the back, and you didn't want to say anything. Come on, folks. Everybody's got to talk in here. If you know the answer, I mean, the worst that could happen is I'm going to say close but not right, and it's no big deal. It's not a big deal if you have the wrong answer. I'd rather have you thinking about this. Okay? When mostly young men in college, the drinking competitions and parties that they have, very, 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 very dangerous. And naturally, at that age, we're talking about older teenagers, right? They're invulnerable. Think back to when you were a teenager. It's much more recent than I was a teenager, but I know I was invulnerable. And people do not think about the consequences. It's also very hard to tell younger people to think about what this drug is going to do to them down the road. And they don't believe that anything's going to happen to them from massive drinking binges. And it is those drunken parties, typically college fraternity parties or other college parties, where we see fatal overdoses. They're rare. The numbers aren't very high, but they do happen. And what's so sad about it is that it's easily preventable. It's easily preventable, but people don't want to listen, particularly at that age. Okay. Okay, those are the essential effects of alcohol. Let's take a look at what happens with, now this is just simply the effects based on dose. Do most people drink to excess in society? What do you think?
No. No.
Sarah?
No.
Why not?
Why don't they?
Yeah. Use the microphone.
I don't know. I don't know why they don't.
We can't hear you unless you're holding the mic.
I don't know why they don't.
Okay,
I don't
folks,
think
how
that
many
they
of
do.
you have ever had a hangover? Let me see a raise of hands. Let's pan out. Don, can you pan out to the class for a sec? Okay, my hand is up too. What happens when we have a hangover? What do we say to ourselves? Oh my God, never again. Well, what happens is that most people do not drink to excess because of the effects. First of all, when you drink too much alcohol, it interferes with your ability to function on a day-to-day basis. So luckily, most people do not drink to excess. Now, when people do, and this is true not only for alcohol, but it's true for all the drugs, where do we find the heaviest use patterns?
Holidays, special occasions,
Okay, for people in general, but what ages do we find the heaviest use patterns?
when they're younger.
Roughly teenage years to young 20s. You can take a look at drug data, and this is not just alcohol, but it's certainly true with alcohol. What tends to happen with most drug use is that it tends to peak somewhere in late teens to early 20s, and then by mid to late 20s, drug use starts to go down. So what we see is most of the heavy drug use, not all of it, is done by teenagers and young adults. Then when they start to have responsibilities in their lives that interfere with them partying and taking drugs and alcohol, that tends to mediate the use of alcohol. So part of what I was asking is, why don't most people drink to excess? Because the effects. They interfere with your ability to function. People don't like having hangovers. And therefore, for most people after the age of 25, and some people before the age of 25, alcohol and other drugs are somewhat self-limiting if they impair you. Does that make sense? However, there are some people who drink excessively and drink chronically. So in addition to simply looking at the effects based on BAL, I think it's important to take a look at what excessive and chronic use does. Does anybody know? Has anybody worked with alcoholic clients? Other than that? Nobody? Has anybody ever been around alcoholic people? What are some of the things that you see? I want to get other people talking in here. This shouldn't be the Susan and Matt show. Yeah, Flora.
Kind of slower reactions.
Okay, while they're drunk, they have slower reactions.
Well, at all times.
All times. Okay, you're talking about somebody who's been drinking for many, many years.
Many years.
Okay, what we're looking at there are a variety of different symptoms. One of the things that alcohol does is that it does create, or can create, permanent brain damage. A syndrome called Korsakoff-Wernicke syndrome. Korsakoff-Wernicke syndrome. And essentially what that does is that it's brain deterioration and atrophy, literally. It's a neurological disorder that causes amnesia. What you see is that people start not remembering things, and it's not just the aging process, although that might be a part of it, but more so it's the effect of the alcohol on the brain. We see amnesia, we see loss of short-term memory, we see disorientation. Sometimes you even see hallucinations. By the time it gets to any of these syndromes, you see hallucinations. Emotional disturbances, double vision, loss of motor control. And yes, when you're saying that they react more slowly, that's because the alcohol has had a permanent and probably irreversible effect on the brain. So when you say they're not just like that when they're drunk, but they're like that all the time, the alcohol has probably taken a toll on the brain. Have you ever taken a look physically at what happens to people who are alcohol dependent? Anybody? You've all lived sheltered lives and you haven't worked with clients who are alcohol dependent? Nobody in your families or your friends' families? Amy?
Tooth decay, a lot of times. Tooth decay?
Yeah, and what happens there, and by the way, this is true for any drug, but it's certainly true for alcohol. At the point that you're looking at addiction, and I'm going to say this across the board, all addiction looks very much the same. People stop taking care of themselves. When the drug has become the focus of their life, they stop eating, they stop brushing their teeth, they stop bathing themselves, and because they stop brushing their teeth, other drugs cause worse tooth decay, but certainly they stop brushing their teeth. The first thing that they reach for in the morning is, in this case, a drink and something sweet. The nutrition goes to hell. And what you see, the picture that you see with all forms of true addiction is very much the same. You're looking at somebody who is now emaciated because they've stopped eating, because the drug takes precedence, right? You're looking at people whose personal appearance is no longer as important to them as their drug. So you see significant behavioral changes and physical changes in that person. Anything else? Yeah. First, is that Ruth? Yeah, Ruth.
Some of them become like antisocial. They don't want to be around other people. They're hiding because they're hiding maybe their alcohol use.
Yeah, well, one of the things that you see is antisocial behavior. You see aggression in some people. Some people you see depression. Some people you see anxiety. So it has a very hard toll on not just mental capabilities, but emotions as well. Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, one of the physical effects is liver disease.
Absolutely.
Cirrhosis of the liver, which then can kind of snowball into all these other issues when the liver stops functioning.
Yeah, liver damage typically occurs in stages. 3 stages, and unfortunately they are totally irreversible. The first thing that you typically see is what they call a fatty liver, where the liver actually changes and becomes more fatty. The next stage, if they keep drinking, is alcohol-induced hepatitis. And the next and final stage, and you've already alluded to that, is cirrhosis, where the liver is so cirrhotic that this is the point at which they need a liver transplant. But if they're still drinking, they're not going to get on a list for a liver transplant because they're just going to destroy the new liver. So again, what you see is that it has a toll on the brain. It has a toll on the liver. You also find high blood pressure, much increased risk of high blood pressure, effects on the heart attacks, heart arrhythmias, and something called cardiomyopathy, which is in fact a disease of the heart muscle. So what you see with people who are heavy chronic drinkers is that you see an increased risk, not only physically, and on just about most body organs, because we'll take a look. We've talked now about the brain, we've talked about the liver, but you also see their overall, and now we're talking about the heart. So what you see is that their overall functioning decreases dramatically. And very late stage alcohol dependence, again, we're talking now about physical dependence, is characterized not only by cirrhosis, but also by what we talked about before, the severe withdrawal syndrome, which includes those shakes, delirium tremens, hallucinations, and with alcohol convulsions, and that's what kills people. And I've already said, if use is abruptly discontinued, if they're physically dependent, they could die. So that's the only reason that I ever try to explain physical dependence from just dependence in general, I want the drug kind of dependence, is that when people are physically dependent on alcohol and you tell them to stop using, they could die. Any questions about that? Yeah, Betty.
I had a question. So is there such a thing as a functional alcoholic, or that term was just made up?
Why are you hearing me sigh? I can give you my take on it. I think if a person is functioning, they are not alcoholic. By the time somebody, and this is part of, I'm trying to be very polite about this. This is part of the mythology and ideology that is out there. It's the idea, and the research, by the way, doesn't bear this out, the idea of one drink, one drunk. Now, that might be true for some of the population of heavy dysfunctional drinkers and alcoholics, but it's certainly not true for most. And therefore, it's part of the ideology that says, once you have ever been an alcoholic or alcohol dependent, the minute you start drinking again, you're not going to go back to normal drinking, you're going to go right back to alcoholic drinking. And the concept of the functional alcoholic comes from the notion that somebody can be clean and sober, but since they're still an alcoholic, once an alcoholic, remember, it's once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. And that meaning has changed over time, by the way. What it has come to mean, and it was never meant to mean this, what it has come to mean is that if you stop going to your AA meetings, even if you're not drinking, they call you a functional alcoholic. Does that make sense? I will tell you my take on it and the more scientific research take on it. And there's big debate about this in the literature, and there really are two camps, by the way. So there's no clear and easy answer. I think if somebody is, the other idea of a functional alcoholic, that's one concept, that you stop drinking, but since you're an alcoholic and you're no longer coming to meetings, even though you stop drinking, you're a functional alcoholic. The other idea of functional alcoholic are people who drink heavily and still function. Because one of the things that we see with people who drink to excess is that if you keep it up very long, you're going to stop functioning. Because go back to that list of what goes on as the BAL goes up. So what they have called functional alcoholics are people who refuse to get treatment because they say, yes, I drink, it's not a problem. And in fact, when we talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we see with alcohol use, when you take a look at all of these different signs and symptoms, one of the things that you see is that there are some people that are just simply heavy drinkers. They do not get DUIs. They do not get thrown in jail. They don't get aggressive. There are some people that are simply heavy drinkers and they refuse to get treatment. And what I'm going to say is that most probably it depends on their drinking pattern. If they are drinking to excess, it is eventually going to hit the liver and the body, no question about that. But if people are drinking and still going to work, still functioning in their everyday life, and they're drinking heavily, I think my own take on this, I think it's more accurate to call them heavy drinkers. By the way, the term alcoholic has no scientific meaning. Let's think about that. The term alcohol, this is important. The term alcoholic is a term that we use to describe people whose drinking patterns we don't like. Well, think about that. The term alcoholic has no scientific consensus as to who the alcoholic is. So therefore, the alcoholic can be somebody who only drinks on weekends and gets crazy drunk, We can call a person who drinks every day to the point of passing out an alcoholic. Now here we're talking, remember we talked last week about knowing the pattern really counts? Now, do they both have alcohol-related problems? No questions about it. But there is no scientific consensus on what kind of drinking pattern is alcoholic. But we know it when we see it. And in fact, if you take a look at the diagnostic categories for alcohol dependence and alcohol abuse, they never use the term alcoholic. It's a layman's term. We use it and we think we know what it is. But yet it describes so many different patterns of drinking alcohol that it becomes, in my opinion, essentially meaningless. It doesn't give us enough concrete indicators to go on to tell when somebody is, in fact, quote unquote, an alcoholic. I can tell you, based on DSM diagnoses, when somebody is alcohol dependent. I can tell you, based on DSM diagnoses, when somebody is abusing alcohol and is not dependent. Do you understand the distinction? But to use the term alcoholic, it's in essence, I'm not going to say a meaningless concept, but it's a concept that is so loosely defined that you could look at one person and say, he's an alcoholic. And you could look at that person and say, no, he's not. It depends on how you define alcoholism. And that gets into a whole philosophical argument about what is alcoholism as opposed to alcohol dependence. Do you all understand that distinction? Alcohol dependence has strict diagnostic categories and criteria that you have to go by to diagnose that. Whereas the notion that somebody is simply an alcoholic gets applied to people whose drinking patterns we don't like. And the drinking pattern that might offend you might not be the same as the drinking pattern that offends you. But yet there are certain patterns of drinking alcohol that are clearly and unquestionably dangerous that I think all of us would take a look at and say, yes, that's a problem drinker. And we would say, yes, that is an alcoholic drinking pattern. But yet it has no scientific consensus as to what we mean by alcoholic. Nor has it ever been a scientific term, but yet we throw it around and use it very loosely. So my take on that, Freddie, is that the people that they call functional alcoholics, they are simply heavy drinkers. In fact, there's a very famous book by Herbert Fingerette. It's a couple decades old now, but it's really worth reading. It's called Heavy Drinking, or Heavy Drinkers. Heavy Drinking, I think. And he really makes the argument that there are heavy drinkers who are not alcoholics. All because a person drinks doesn't mean that they're going to be impaired. And some people can drink heavily and not become impaired. And people who believe in the concept of the alcoholic will say that person's a functional alcoholic. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? Because what we're really broaching on now is big philosophical issues. Okay, we are going to go to break in about 11 seconds, so let's do that now. Okay, we're back with drugs in society after break. Any questions about alcohol? We just finished talking about alcohol, other than where you can get it. Any questions? Okay, let's move on. Back to the PowerPoint. Okay, other drugs that rats really like and people tend to like are the sedatives and hypnotics. This is a very diverse group of drugs that have come from different chemical classes, but they have similar effects. They're grouped together because of the psychological effects that they have. Not so much the physical effects, because those can be different, because again, very diverse group. I'm going to give you some names here. All of these drugs at low doses, remember we talked about the effects of a drug are dose related. At lower doses, these drugs can be used to reduce anxiety. At higher doses, they act as hypnotics to induce sleep. So when we talk about a sedative property, that's a property that reduces anxiety. When we talk about a hypnotic property, that's where it actually, you're using higher doses to help people go to sleep. Several different kinds. Again, this is a diverse group of drugs, and even within the non-barbiturates, each of these is different from each other. Of the non-barbiturates, some of the older sleeping medications like chlorohydrate, Miltown, and Equinil, those were drugs that were used for sleep. And they're still important because sometimes elderly patients cannot tolerate some of the other drugs, and the safer drugs to use are drugs like chlorohydrate and Miltown. Quaalude, I alluded to that before when I was talking about Karen Ann Quinlan. Quaalude was a very powerful hypnotic drug that was very, very, very abused all throughout the 60s and 70s. And they finally took it off the market. It was manufactured in Mexico pharmaceutically by pharmaceutical companies under the name Mandrax. That's also off the market. Nobody makes these drugs anymore. They had a very high liability, not so much for addiction, although it's possible, but serious, serious abuse. And very commonly, remember we talked last week about the fact that most people are multiple drug users, polydrug users, they use more than one drug at a time. A lot of people would mix Quaaludes with alcohol, just as Karen Ann Quinlan did, and become stuporous. So it became known as a very dangerous drug because so many people were abusing it. A drug that we hear about today, GHB. What do we hear about it? What does it have a bad rep for being? Yep, Allison.
Date rape drug?
Yes, one of the date rape drugs. And in fact, do you know what the biggest date rape drug is? Matt?
Alcohol.
Alcohol, absolutely. Alcohol is the biggest date rape drug, but yet we're going to see Rohypnol and GHB get very bad press for being the quote-unquote date rape drugs. And why is that? Because they are essentially colorless and odorless. You can slip it into somebody's alcohol. Unlike other drugs that might have a taste where they would recognize that they were being dosed with something, these are drugs that don't have much of a taste, and you can slip it into somebody's drink, and it gets done, but it doesn't get done as frequently as alcohol gets used all in and of itself as a way to rape people. And that's one of the ways that we vilify drugs. GHB was used for many years relatively safely. It was used in medicine, and they stopped using it in medicine, and then they started using it in bodybuilding. And in fact, it was available over the counter until relatively recently. Again, at higher doses, this can induce sleep. And it has some very significant dangers associated with it. But as with anything else, the dangers are dose-related. Is everybody clear about that? It's not just whether you use the drug, it's at what dose are you taking it and how frequently do you take it. Barbiturates, or barbiturates, yeah, Fleur.
Why did bodybuilders need it? Just to sleep?
No, they were using it as a steroid. You can read more about it in the Kuhn book. It was being used, again, prescribed as a dietary supplement. Is it really it's not an anabolic steroid, but it was being used that way for bulking up. And again, by and large, for most of the history of GHB, it's been around for a long time, by and large, it's been used safely. But what happens is when the word gets out that, hey, here's a drug you can get high on, the word spreads and then people start using it in a less functional pattern. So, and it is now totally illegal. It used to be a legal drug bought over the counter, and it is now totally illegal. Okay, barbiturates. I'm going to roam as we talk about these, John. So take a look at the names of these first. These are the drugs of my parents' generation. Now, what do I mean by? And here we're looking at drugs like Nembutal, Seconal, Amitol, Butazol, Luminol. These are just some of the names. The one you're probably most familiar with is phenobarbital. Have you heard of phenobarbital? That's the one that is most used. It is used for seizure disorders, and that's why it has other medical uses. And you can come back over to me when you get a chance. It is used for seizure disorders. When I say these are the drugs of my parents' generation, these drugs are very, very, very good sleeping aids. These drugs were widely prescribed in the 1960s to help people go to sleep. There's a liability, though. These drugs are very long-lasting drugs. In other words, the properties of the drug last for a very, very long time. Instead of a short high, in this case, short sleep, you sleep for a very long time. And when you wake up, after 8 hours of sleep, you wake up tired because it is such a long-acting drug. And these were being handed out left and right in my parents' generation because these were the new sleeping pills. Before that, before we had the barbiturates, we had drugs like chlorohydrate and Miltown, which were effective, but not as effective as this at inducing sleep. But the problem is, because they are such long-acting drugs, the psychoactive properties last so long, after 8 hours, you wake up and you're still dragging and drowsy. So what doctors did then is they decided, well, we can give you an amphetamine which will pep you up. Amphetamines were legal. In fact, amphetamines are still legal. But what we saw, particularly during the 1960s up through the early 1970s, we saw a rash of what I'm going to call doctor-prescribed drug abuse. These are not people who would go out into the street looking for a dealer, right? But they would go to their doctor's offices asking for a prescription to help them sleep. And then when they was dragging so much because these drugs are so long-acting, the doctor would then prescribe a pep pill. And we're going to be talking about the amphetamines in a little bit. So the barbiturates, very, very good drugs, very, very handy drugs. However, they are very long-lasting. They are still used, but where are they primarily used? For things other than just simply putting people to sleep every night. It's very rare that these drugs will be prescribed for that. You see these drugs used pre- and post-surgery. Certainly phenobarbital is used very specifically for seizure disorders and other medical uses as well. But the liability is that they are so long-lasting. They're very effective, but they're very long-lasting. Okay, back over to the PowerPoint when you get a chance. What's happening here? There we go. Oops, I skipped by a slide. Here we go. The other group, remember we talked about this being a diverse group of drugs? The other group are the benzodiazepines. These are the Valium-type drugs. They're all chemically, structurally, spit that out, Susan, structurally related to Valium. Structurally related to Valium. This is just a partial list, the most common. The most common, Valium, Xanax, we're going to talk about that in a little bit, Ativan, Librium, Restoril, Dalmane, Halcyon, Klonopin, and Rohypnol. Rohypnol is not manufactured here in the United States. You can come back to me now. Rohypnol is not manufactured here in the United States. It is manufactured in Mexico, and it is illegal here. It is simply not made here. But these drugs essentially all do the same thing. At lower doses, they're prescribed for anxiety. And in fact, these are some of the most widely prescribed drugs today. At higher doses, they are prescribed to put people to sleep. And they have pretty much taken the place for most people and most doctors of the barbiturates of my parents' generation. Why? Because they are safer. You don't see the high rates of dependence on them, but that doesn't mean that people don't abuse them. Is everybody clear about that? In fact, one of the patterns that we're seeing now, more so than we've seen in the past, or at least we're documenting it better, is that one of the patterns that we're seeing now, particularly among teenagers, not that they're using other drugs less, but they are now switching to these pill parties where they raid their parents' medicine cabinets, and we see more massive abuse of legally prescribed drugs, but not legally prescribed to the people who are using them. Does that make sense? Or sometimes they are legally prescribed to the people who are using them, and they like the way they make them feel, so they become drug seekers. They become drug seekers. And that's a really hard thing to try to weed out. Does this person have a real medical need for this drug? And is the person using it appropriately? Or is this person simply a drug seeker because they like the high from this? Very, very hard to tell. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So let's take a look at the primary effects. The sedatives and hypnotics. Again, we talked about this. As an anti-anxiety drug, they reduce anxiety. As a hypnotic, they induce sleep. So I could be using the very same drug for two different reasons. I could be using it during the day to alleviate anxiety, and simply a higher dose before I go to bed at night. Or some people don't use it for anxiety and use it only sporadically for sleep. The downside of this, when you use it for sleep, remember we talked about tolerance? Eventually people become fairly tolerant to these drugs when they use it not for anxiety, but more so for sleep. More so for sleep. Because you need higher and higher doses to put you to sleep. How are these drugs administered? Most typically orally. However, you can also give an injection of Valium. If any of you have ever had dental surgery or other kinds of surgery, sometimes they will give you a Valium drip. Why? Because what does it do? It relaxes you, and they usually put you in that kind of twilight state where you're still conscious, but relaxed enough that you can undergo surgery. There are other shorter acting benzodiazepines that they use also in surgery that keep you awake, but you cause such incredible amnesia that you forget about the procedure. You're not even aware. But these are very, very handy drugs, because if a doctor who's doing surgery on you needs you conscious but doesn't want you remembering the surgery, some of the shorter acting benzodiazepines, not the ones on this list, there are other drugs that are used specifically for surgery. A drug called Versed, V-E-R-S-E-D, is a good example of that. That's also a benzodiazepine, a short-acting benzodiazepine. And why is it used in surgery? Because it wears off very quickly and it leaves you with no memory of the procedure. But that's not the most typical use. The most typical use of all of these has to do with the fact that we're looking to either alleviate anxiety or induce sleep. So you can take it by injection as well. Okay, let's talk about tolerance with the sedatives. It's variable. As a general rule, folks, barbiturates have much more tolerance associated with them than do the benzodiazepines. They also have more physical dependence associated with them. So when we take a look at this, it's extremely variable. If you get tolerance to barbiturates relatively quickly if you use them daily to go to sleep. And that's very often how they are prescribed. Very interestingly, about the benzodiazepines, also tolerance develops relatively quickly when you use them for sleep. After a while, you have to take higher and higher doses to put yourself to sleep. If you're using benzodiazepines for the anti-anxiety effects, the tolerance develops much more slowly. It will develop if you use them every day, but it develops much more slowly. And think about that. That makes sense, because what are you doing? You're taking a lower dose to begin with. And you're treating anxiety rather than trying to knock yourself out to put yourself to sleep. So where do we find cross-tolerance? To other sedatives and hypnotics. So if you are tolerant to Valium, you're going to probably be fairly tolerant to Xanax. If you're tolerant to Xanax, you're going to be tolerant to Ativan. You're following that? Okay, questions about that? Any? Okay. I'm going to go back and sit down again. Okay, let's talk about physical dependence. Again, the most liability for physical dependence comes with barbiturates, or barbiturates. It's pronounced both ways, by the way. Both ways are correct, barbiturates or barbiturates. Chronic high doses of barbiturates will lead to physical dependence. And remember we talked about this earlier? That type of physical dependence can kill you. If you try telling people to get off these drugs without getting detoxed. And that's because these drugs work on GABA receptors that can cause convulsions. That's one of the reasons. So what you get with high chronic doses of barbiturates, and you can also get this with daily long-term doses of benzodiazepines and GHB. Again, it depends not just how often you take it, but the dose that you take it. And if you're taking these drugs enough so they create tolerance, and you have to take higher and higher doses to get the effect, eventually you're going to become physically dependent. I've heard people say there is no physical dependence on GHB, and that's simply not true. It's harder to get physically dependent on GHB than it is on barbiturates, but it's possible. So what do we find with cross-dependence? Same thing to other CNS depressants. The danger of these drugs is if you mix these drugs with each other. You mix these drugs with alcohol, you mix these drugs with opiates, you're getting that supra-additive effect. Remember we talked about that? So it can be very, very dangerous. Back to me now. Any questions about the sedatives and hypnotics? Okay, let's talk about the short-acting versus long-acting. One of the things the pharmaceutical companies try to do, because we don't want to prescribe a pill to have somebody go to sleep and have them wake up groggy, right? The whole idea is that it puts them to sleep and they have a restful sleep and they wake up and are ready to embrace the day, right? Well, so in order to do that, because sometimes Valium does leave people groggy, sometimes Ativan, again, these are relatively safe drugs if they're used as directed. But sometimes they're not as long-acting as barbiturates, but they're long enough acting that sometimes people wake up feeling draggy. So one of the things that the pharmaceutical companies try to do is to make shorter and shorter acting benzodiazepines. Makes sense, right? Because if you can get a drug in and out of a person's system really quickly, you're not going to have the sleeping pill hangover. The problem is, the biggest problems that we have seen are with the shorter acting benzodiazepines. The biggest problems. They tend to cause more amnesia, and withdrawal from them is extremely, extremely hard. So if you're working with a client who has been given prescribed Xanax, and they're following the doctor's prescription, they're not abusing the drug, but they're following the prescription, and the doctor has to keep raising the dose, because what's happened? The person, if they're taking it every day, has now become tolerant, and they want to quit, you need to get them into detox. People find it very, very hard to detox from Xanax on their own. And that's because it is such a short-acting drug that when you go into withdrawal, the withdrawal is very sudden and is pretty nasty. And what does that do? When people don't like the way the withdrawal feels, it propels them back into using the drug again to alleviate the symptoms of withdrawal. Does that make sense? So again, the more dangerous and problematic of the benzodiazepines are the shorter-acting ones. Halcyon is a very good example. It's a drug that has been used for a long time in dentistry. It is banned in most other countries. Not every other country, banned in most other countries, because one of the things that it does is that it causes, for many people, large chunks of amnesia, large chunks of time where they have amnesia and don't know what they've done. And this gets exacerbated when they take these drugs and drink. This gets exacerbated when they take these drugs and drink. So therefore, we don't want people to have, when I say amnesia, I'm talking about literal blackouts. literal blackouts. I have worked with clients who would tell me that they woke up in a strange place, they didn't know where they were or how they got there, and they had lost 2 and 3 days of time. On not just this drug alone, but combining this drug with even a little bit of alcohol. So be aware that that is certainly one of the liabilities of the shorter acting. And again, some of these drugs have been banned in other countries, and we still use them. And again, do not forget, it's not just yes or no to the drug, but the dose. How frequently they use it, and do they use it with other drugs? Any questions about that? Okay, over to the opioids. Back to the PowerPoint. The opioids and opiates, these are all natural substances or synthetic substances, doesn't make a difference, that possess morphine-like action. And we're going to talk about what that action is. All of these drugs have morphine-like action. I will tell you right now that despite some of the mythology that's out there that says a natural drug is better for you than a synthetic drug, that's nonsense, folks. What the synthetic drugs do is that they simply mimic the molecules of the natural drugs. They are so composed so that they mimic the effects. So here's a partial list. These are the most commonly used opiates. Opium, we don't see a whole lot of that around. Opium has been used historically in China. Most opium is produced in Southeast Asia, although it is now coming up from Mexico as well. Can be grown in Mexico. It can be grown in a variety of climates. Historically, it was Southeast Asia, and we're also seeing opium being grown in places like Afghanistan. And there's all kinds of propaganda about how if you're using drugs, you're supporting the war on terror because it's grown in Afghanistan. Some people believe that. These are drugs that come from the opium poppy, and they are derivatives of the opium poppy. So what are we looking at? Morphine, which is widely used in medicine. And Dr. Hill will be here later this semester to talk to you about the use of opiates in pain management. A drug that many of you might have been prescribed by your dentist, codeine, that's also derived directly from the opium poppy. And heroin. Heroin, you can come back over to me for a minute, Don. Interesting history of heroin. Heroin was invented to combat, with the idea of combating morphine addiction. One of the things that we know about morphine is that it is extremely, extremely addictive, causes very significant physical dependence if people use it for any length of time. It has significant symptoms associated with having to do with tolerance. You gain tolerance relatively quickly. Not immediately, but relatively quickly if you use it every day, several times a day, over and over. And most of these drugs, as you will hear next week, from the lecturer next week who's going to talk about the history of drugs and drug control, most of these drugs at the turn of the 19th century, 1800s, early 1900s, were sold in patent medicines. What do I mean by patent medicine? These are medicines that were patented, not necessarily by pharmaceutical companies, but these are medicines, these are concoctions that people would dream up, and they would go around selling them door to door for different kinds of ailments. So it was not uncommon to find morphine and cocaine and drugs like that in these patent medicines. And people liked, and they were prescribed for all kinds of ills. And then we came down with some legislation that pretty much stopped that. So these are drugs that are derived directly from the opium poppy. Back to the PowerPoint. In addition to those, we also have opioids. When we talk about opioids, those are the synthetically derived drugs that have similar actions to morphine. Similar actions. So what are we looking at? You've heard about a lot of these. Demerol, very important use in medicine, very important in pain management. Dilaudid. Fentanyl. Again, these are drugs that are used for pain management. Methadone. Have people heard about methadone? It is also a synthetic opioid, and it is used to treat, not cure, it is used to treat heroin addiction. What methadone does is that it has all of the actions of heroin, except it doesn't get people high. So we're going to talk about what those actions are. It's also taken orally, so you don't have the risk of injecting drugs. And today, at least at this point in time, it is still the most effective treatment to get people who are heroin users dealing and buying drugs in the illegal drug market, probably ripping off your house and my house to get money for their drugs. We put them on methadone if they're willing to go into methadone maintenance. And we have, if it's done correctly, we have fairly good success. Why do they go on methadone? Because they don't want to go through withdrawal, because the withdrawal is pretty horrible. And these drugs are very good painkillers. I'm talking about physical pain, not emotional pain necessarily, but physical pain. So if somebody is accustomed to having heroin running through their brain and through their body and it's killing pain, they're not going to want to get off the heroin or get off an opiate if it's doing a good job at killing pain. And typically what people do is when they are ready to go on methadone maintenance, there are clinics that they can go to, and they get prescribed. It's a very safe, legally made drug. It's done in an oral solution. And if people stay on methadone maintenance, many of them stay heroin-free for the rest of their lives. Many of them, however, do not. Many of them decide that they're not happy with the methadone because it doesn't get them high, and sometimes they go back and forth on and off methadone. Other common drugs that are used. We've heard a lot about this lately. Oxycontin, oxycodone, right? Oxycontin and oxycodone. That is the new opioid of choice of abuse. And for a while, doctors were handing these pills out left and right. Older generations, Percodan, its chemical name is hydrocodone, its generic name. And not at all surprisingly, drugs that have been prescribed for many years, since at least the 1960s, maybe before that, Darvon, Darvocet, a newer version of it called Ultracet. These three drugs have higher liabilities, though. These three drugs are typically combined in a pill with acetaminophen. Tylenol, acetaminophen. And one of the dangers of the Darvon and Darvocet and Ultracet, when it's combined with acetaminophen, is that people become tolerant to the effects of the opiates in this fairly quickly. They do not become tolerant to the effects of the acetaminophen. Does anybody know what too much acetaminophen does? Yeah, Matt?
It can damage your liver.
Serious liver damage. So part of the problem is that people who are not trying to kill themselves, they're simply trying to be out of pain, have to keep increasing the dose, because the more effective of the two painkillers is what? Is the opiate part, right? And they have to keep increasing the dose to get a high enough dose of the opiate, but by doing it, because it's combined in one pill with acetaminophen, they can be seriously damaging their livers. And there's been a fairly good argument in the last couple of years that these drugs, for that reason, should be taken off the market. Because even though they're effective painkillers, because you gain tolerance to the opiate effect, but you don't gain tolerance to the acetamin effect. And the acetamin effect, the acetamin in it, you have to keep increasing, because it comes in one pill. To increase the dose of the Darvon, what are you also doing? Increasing the dose of the acetaminophen, and that is the part that's dangerous. Any questions about that? And about a year ago, there was big controversy about this, about should we take this off the market? Yeah, Matt?
It seems like I've read about something similar to that with, I think in the reading they were talking about the dextromorphine, like the cough syrup.
Yes.
But how some people were abusing, I think especially kids, abusing certain cough medicines like oral pills that had acetaminophen in it. And so they were taking all of it for the DXM,
right,
didn't realize that they were poisoning their liver with the acetaminophen. Yeah,
DXM, dextromethorphan, is sold over the counter in preparations, cold preparations, along with, you know how all of the drug companies now, if you go to get something for a cold or a cough, you've got your choice of these medicines, right? And the same exact brand, and this one has stuff in it for colds only. This one has for colds and coughs. This one, you're following that? So what happens is that the kids who are trying to get high from these drugs are taking it for the DXM, or the dextromethorphan. However, in that liquid preparation or pill preparation, there is also acetaminophen. And therefore, what they're doing is that as they keep increasing the dose, if the DXM isn't going to get them, the acetaminophen will. So those combinations are extremely dangerous, particularly because if you take too much acetaminophen, you can cause serious liver damage. You know, folks, the bottom line is there is no drug that's without liability. Let me say that again. There is no drug that is without liability. All drugs have some liability associated with them. Some drugs have more liability, some have less, but all drugs have liability. So that even those very safe, what we perceive to be safe over-the-counter medications, are not always necessarily as safe as we think they are. It depends not just on the drug, but how it's used. Do you know what happens if you take too much aspirin? Isn't aspirin a wonderful, safe drug? Yes? By and large. However, if you take too much, you can you can really erode your stomach lining. Again, all drugs, I cannot repeat this often enough, all drugs have some degree of liability. And the question is, again, how often you take it and how much you take. So drugs that are safe, taken only every now and then at low doses, can become very, very dangerous if taken more frequently at high doses. Does that make sense? What I'm trying to do is demystify this thing about legal versus illegal drugs, because all drugs have some liabilities. Some just simply have more than others. Okay, back over to the PowerPoint. And you're going to hear more about the opioids from Dr. Stratton Hill. The primary effects. These drugs are CNS depressants, which means that they also depress your breathing. They depress your heartbeat. They are the best pain relievers, period, with one exception. They're the best pain relievers for most conditions except, I'm going to use the term here, neuropathic pain. Nerve-ending pain, neuropathic pain. If you know anybody who's diabetic, anybody have friends or family members who are diabetic and they have neuropathic pain from their diabetes? The unfortunate thing is that the opiates and opioids are not particularly good at neuropathic pain, but they are probably the most effective painkillers for just about every other kind of pain. And they are both overprescribed and underprescribed and misprescribed. What do these drugs do? They cause euphoria. When people are trying to take these drugs to get high as opposed to taking them for pain, they cause a very significant euphoria. What you will hear from Dr. Hill is that when somebody is truly in pain, they take these pills and what happens? They get out of pain and they do not get high. Pain acts as an antagonist, I'll define that in a minute, to the euphoric effects of the opiates. Let me repeat that. Pain, when you have real pain, physical pain, acts as an antagonist to the euphoric effects of the opiates. And you're going to get a whole lecture on this, so I'm not going to go into much more detail. What do I mean by antagonist? Anybody have an idea? Matt again, okay.
It's got a counterbalancing effect, so it diminishes the pain, but that means you don't become euphoric.
That means what?
That means you have no pain, but you also have no euphoria if it's used appropriately.
Yeah, if it's used appropriately and for somebody is in pain, they simply do not get euphoric. They don't get high, they simply get out of pain. We're going to talk more about antagonists, drugs that are true antagonists, and that has to do with the drugs, how they fill the receptor sites. But does everybody understand this concept? That if somebody's truly in pain and they're taking the opiates or opioids, they're not going to be high, they're simply going to be out of pain. However, if they're not in pain and they are taking it to get high, these drugs produce a fairly powerful euphoria. Do you understand that distinction? It depends on the intent of the use and whether or not we're trying to block pain. What else do these drugs do? And here's where they get dangerous. They cause sedation and drowsiness. They depress your breathing. Now, why do I say that here's where they get dangerous? People tend to become tolerant to the euphoric effects of these drugs fairly quickly. They do not become tolerant to the CNS depressant effects, and therefore they keep increasing their doses to get the euphoria, and it can lead to very dangerous conditions where they're shutting their breathing down. Y'all following that? Another thing that these drugs do very, very well is that they reduce diarrhea. They constipate you. Unfortunately, there is no tolerance to the constipation. There's no tolerance effect. In other words, you're not going to become tolerant to being constipated. If you take opiates on a daily basis, you're going to be constipated. That's simply what the drug does. So here's a good example of a drug that has many different effects. It creates euphoria. It also suppresses coughs, which is why you find codeine, particularly in cough medicine. Fairly good cough suppressant. So here are drugs that have several different effects, and this is also a good example to talk about tolerance, because you become tolerant to different effects at different times. So if you get too tolerant to the euphoric effects, which is usually what happens first, and you take more, what you're doing is you're compromising your respiration. Does that make sense to y'all? And that is truly one of the dangers of these drugs. How are these drugs taken? When they're used medically and prescribed, in most cases they are taken orally. In most cases. How else can they be taken? Let's go back to medical use first. Sometimes patients have conditions that they cannot tolerate oral medications. Somebody who's going through chemotherapy and is in pain and is nauseous and is literally vomiting up the oral medications. So what are we going to do? Well, if they're actually in a medical facility, we can give them injections, right? But when we send them home, we usually do not send people home with injectable drugs. So sometimes we give them suppositories, anal suppositories, which is another route of administration. I think we talked about this briefly, right, last week? When people are using these drugs to get high, as opposed to for pain, most typically the pattern that you see is they rarely start with oral, because what we're usually talking about is heroin, although we could be starting with other kinds of pills like oxycodone. But typically what we see is that people will, if it's strong enough, heroin is strong enough to be smoked, people will try to smoke it. The problem with smoking heroin, and it's the only one of the drugs we're going to be talking about, is that the things that are usually used to cut and dilute the heroin also make it less effective to be smoked. And therefore, remember I said to you last week that for most drugs, the fastest way to get the drug into the system is smoking. Do you remember that? Very close to injecting, but most people won't put needle in their arms. However, with the opiates, what you see, particularly with heroin, is that heroin, the most direct route and the biggest kick is going to come out of injecting it. So therefore, you might find somebody who starts off smoking heroin thinking, okay, I'm not going to get high from this. I'm always smoking it. I'm not injecting it. But the bottom line is, heroin, all the opiates cause a relatively quick dependence if you use them every day, several times a day. You know, following it? If you use it sporadically every now and then, you're not going to get dependent. But if you use it, and here we're talking about physical dependence, if you use them every day, several times a day, what's going to happen is your tolerance starts to increase, and eventually you're going to become dependent more quickly than most of the other drugs. And that is one of the biggest liabilities of these drugs as pain medications, is that people do become physically dependent, even if they're not drug abusers. I'm going to stand for a minute. Don, we're going to go over to me talking. I'm tired of being a talking head. So we're going to talk for a minute. I'm going to give you a real concrete example. Several years ago, I had major oral surgery. Major. I had several teeth extracted, I had a bone graft put in, and several implants put in at the same time. That's pretty major oral surgery. I know myself, I am a pain wuss. I do not tolerate pain. I also know that I hypermetabolize. I'm thin and I hypermetabolize drugs. Luckily, my oral surgeon knows me well enough to know that I'm not a drug abuser. So before I let him do massive surgery like that, I always say, and I've had a couple implants several times, I always say to my doctor, well, we're going to do this, but before I leave this office, or maybe the week before, I want you to write me a prescription for injectable Demerol. Because I know myself, I'm a pain wuss, and I've been through the surgery before, and I know that I'm not going to, I don't tolerate the oral medications very well when I'm in pain. And he trusts me enough to write me a prescription for injectable Demerol. And remember I told you last week, I hate needles. I hate needles, and even worse, Demerol is a very stingy, stingy shot. Horribly stingy. You have to be really motivated to self-inject Demerol. Anyway, the last time that I had oral surgery, I was not thinking very clearly. I got the Demerol to inject. I came home after the surgery. My mouth was out, swollen like this. I was in serious pain. The minute the Novocaine wore off, I was in serious pain. So what did I do? Injected the Demerol. 3 hours later, starts wearing off, I injected more Demerol. And I injected Demerol for several days in a row. Several days in a row. I also don't like the feeling of Demerol, other than the fact that it kills pain. I don't like that kind of drowsy high. If I was going to pick a high, that's not going to be it. I simply don't like it. So as the pain started wearing off, I was so anxious to get off the Demerol that I simply stopped it. I thought, okay, I don't need this anymore. And guess what happened? Think about this. I've been injecting Demerol 3-4 times a day for 3 or 4 days. What do you think happened? You have to use the microphone.
You inject it again?
Well, no, because I wanted to get off of it. The pain was subsiding. I no longer needed it for pain. And I don't like the feeling of Demerol. Not my drug. Definitely not my drug. What has now happened to my body? Has my body adapted to having the Demerol there 24/7 for several days? And what happens when people suddenly stop using an opiate? Use the microphone.
Withdrawal symptoms.
Yes, I started going through a mild withdrawal. And I said, gee, Susan, you're the drug abuse specialist. Well, I just wanted to be off the Demerol. I wasn't in pain anymore. And the doctor also gave me a prescription for one of the codeine medicines, which I also don't like. And I thought, I really don't need this anymore. And then what I had to do to stop the withdrawal, now it wasn't as profound as what heroin junkies go through, because I'd only been on it for 3 days, but that's how quickly my body had adapted. I started getting nauseous, not that kind of sick nauseous, but I started getting nauseous. I started having aches and pains. I started feeling hot sweats, starting getting chills, and I said, gee, you're the substance abuse specialist, Susan. How could you have done this to yourself? So what I did is I gave myself another shot of Demerol. Then the next 3 hours later, I gave myself half of a dose. Then I gave myself half of that dose and switched over to the oral medications and started titrating the dose down to avoid the withdrawal. Does that make sense to you? So what I'm trying to get at is that these drugs have a relatively quick, if you use them on a regular basis, and particularly if you're injecting them. No, I was not injecting into my arm. I was injecting into the muscle, intramuscular injection. But even people who are not drug abusers, which I'm clearly not, can become physically dependent on a drug that causes physical dependence if they use it in a pattern that causes it. Does that make sense? Now, let me ask you something. Yeah, go ahead, Ruth.
So what does cause the dependency then? Because, I mean, there's a lot of people that are not in a situation like yours that they've been taking the medication for weeks and weeks for pain, then they need it again, and they need it more. Like in your case, you didn't need it, and you knew how to work it out to not use it anymore. But why there's a lot of people that actually become dependent?
Yes, and let's talk about the difference. I was just about to say I was physically dependent on the drug, but I was not addicted to it. I'm giving you a new concept here. I was what I'm trying to get at, physical dependence is the property of the drug. Is everybody clear about that? There are some drugs that simply cause a quicker physical dependence than others. And the opiates and the opioids are drugs that cause, compared to other drugs, a relatively quick physical dependence. It is simply a physical state in which the body has adapted to the drug. Do y'all understand that? I was not addicted, though. If I was addicted, I would go out seeking the drug again. You all follow that? And we're going to come to this at the end of the lecture. Addiction is a behavioral pattern. It's not the physical dependence. Addiction is a pattern of drug seeking. So, to answer your question, Ruth, why do some people continue to use the drugs? Some people, and particularly with the opiates, more so than the other drugs, opiates and opioids, what happens is that when people start to feel the withdrawal, they don't know how to get off the drug. They just keep taking the drug to keep themselves from the pain of the withdrawal. And that's one of the ways that people tend to get hooked on the opiates, even if they were not drug abusers to start with. Does that make sense? Questions? Okay, back to the PowerPoints, because I would like to get us through all the drugs in the next half hour. With the opioids, tolerance is variable. It depends on how the person uses the drug. If I was trying to get high, let's say I'm using it recreationally, and I hate that term recreational drug use, but let's say I'm using it to get high, which is what we mean by recreational drug use. It's variable. If I'm only using it every now and then on weekends and not using it regularly, I'm not going to get tolerance. If I use it regularly, the tolerance increases. Is there cross-tolerance? Yes, to other opiates or opioids. So if I'm tolerant to Darvon, I'm going to be tolerant to Darvocet. If I'm tolerant to heroin, I'm going to be tolerant to fentanyl. You all following that? There's cross-tolerance there. Physical dependence develops with chronic use. And in this case, with the opiates, it happens more quickly than the other drugs. There I was, displaying early signs of physical dependence after only 3 days of injecting the drug. Even though I was using it medically properly, I was still becoming physically dependent. It's simply a property of a drug. And it's characterized by severe withdrawal syndrome. And those are the symptoms we already talked about. When people are dependent on one opiate, they're dependent on the others. You'll follow that? Because they're working on the same receptor sites. Or let me be more accurate, on similar receptor sites. Because there are, in fact, different receptor sites for opiates, and some of the opiates work on one site or the other site. And I believe that Dr. Hill is going to talk about it, so I don't want to get into that now. Very importantly, how many of you have seen Pulp Fiction, the movie Pulp Fiction? Do you remember the scene with the shot of adrenaline straight into the heart? That is about the worst nonsense I've ever heard. When somebody has overdosed on heroin or any opiate, adrenaline is not going to take them out of dying. What you need, and this is important, an antagonist is a drug, in this case a drug, that competes for the receptor sites in the brain. So when we administer an antagonist, what we're doing is we're flooding the brain with a substance that will block the receptors. You're following that? And they will compete with fewer molecules of the other drug, and once they block the receptors, what happens is it stops the action of the opiates. An opiate antagonist will stop the action of the opiates, and then you revive the person, and the person's in withdrawal. If they're physically dependent. You're following that? Somebody takes an overdose of heroin, adrenaline's not going to do it, no matter where you shoot it. However, the antagonist will. So just important to know that there are antagonists for opiates. Very importantly, some of these opiate antagonists are now being used in alcohol treatment. And you'll hear more about that. Let's move on to cocaine. We've already talked about this. Cocaine comes from the coca plant, C-O-C-A, not coca. Not the same as chocolate. Everybody following that? It's a different plant. Luckily, this plant can only be grown in South America and only in high mountainous regions. Because if it could be grown other places, we would be flooded with much, much, much more cocaine on the market. Cocaine is a very short-acting drug. That's one of its biggest liabilities. Does anybody know how long cocaine lasts for? Nobody? Matt.
I think it's probably not more than like maybe 15, 30 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, about 30 minutes. Here we're talking about intranasal. Remember we talked about that last week? When somebody snorts cocaine intranasally, they're going to have a slow onset. So within the first 5 minutes, they're going to feel something. And as the drug reaches higher plasma concentrations and reaches the brain, after about 15 minutes, when it reaches more or less its peak concentration, now you've spent 15 minutes getting to the high that you want, and it only lasts for 15 minutes more. And then it starts leaving the brain real quickly. How many people do you know who are trying to get high want a 15-minute high? No, I'm very serious. Do you know anybody who only wants to be high 15 minutes? Yeah.
People who like cocaine.
But they like it so much, but they don't like the short duration, which is why cocaine, more so than any other drug, lends itself to constant binging. It lends itself to constant binging. Everybody clear about that? That's because, oh, the tablet isn't here. I guess they were having problems with it. I was going to show you a dose time response. Essentially, what happens, put the camera back on me, John. Oh, here we are. Okay. Okay. Try to imagine this is a timeline, since I don't have a tablet to work with. As people start to take cocaine, the first 5 minutes, they're getting high. 10, 15 minutes, they're getting high. Then for 15 more minutes, you all following this? 15 more minutes, the cocaine is psychoactive, and then it stops working, and it starts clearing the brain. As it starts clearing the brain, what do people want? They want to be back up to that level of high that they were at before. And therefore, what happens is that as it starts to filter off, even though they still have plenty of cocaine in their brain, it's not as much as it was there a few minutes ago. And what they tend to do is that they tend to binge. Because cocaine is such a short-acting drug, binging is the most common method that we see, the most common method of administration. Particularly intranasally, when they're taking it intranasally, whether they're shooting it, whether they're smoking it, makes no difference. It's a short-acting drug. You start injecting it and smoking it, it's even shorter acting. Even shorter acting. There's a term that was used to describe the type of liability, and they call it a psychogenic, not psychological addiction, but a psychogenic addiction. Let me explain what that means. Psycho, G-E-N-I-C. What it means is that the brain tricks the person into thinking they need more cocaine, even when there's still plenty of cocaine there. You following that? Again, I wish I had a tablet, but if this is where they're at, as it starts to dip, there's still, take a look at that, there's still plenty of cocaine in the brain, but they want to be back where they were, so they're going to re-administer it. So what we see with cocaine that we do not see with any other drug is that people can buy a bunch of it and say, oh, I'm going to party with this for the weekend, and it's gone in the first few hours. It tends to lend itself to binging because it doesn't stay psychoactive in the brain very long. Does that make sense to y'all? Now you take that same drug and you turn it into something you can smoke or something you can inject, and the high is even shorter, but the high is much more profound. Again, I wish I had, instead of it coming on slowly, everybody watch here for a second, instead of it coming on slowly like that, you'll get an immediate peak within the first few seconds. That same cocaine made smokable or injectable, it's not that high, you get that high. It only lasts for 10 or 15 minutes, quicker in, quicker out, and then it starts to drop. You all following that? So when people say the crack is so much more addictive, it's a different drug. No, it's not. Crack is cocaine. Crack is simply a smokable form of cocaine. And I will put a handout on Blackboard that explains the differences between crack and cocaine. You asked before about freebase. When somebody makes crack, what they're doing is they're adding something to the cocaine hydrochloride. Cocaine as a salt, as a hydrochloride, cannot be smoked. I know we have people that are sprinkling cocaine on the ends of marijuana cigarettes, and they say they're getting higher. The temperature at which it takes to ignite the cocaine burns it up before it actually gets in the brain. So they're wasting their money, in essence. However, cocaine, if it's changed chemically, can be smoked. but you've got to change it chemically first. The powder, you can't smoke the powder. So essentially what they do when we smoke cocaine, you either add baking soda to it and then other preparations to turn it into a hard, rocky substance that can be smoked. You've changed the chemical formulation so it can be smoked. The other way you can smoke cocaine is by taking all the hydrochloride out, so that what you're left with is the original cocaine, the free base. And what you're left with is not only stronger cocaine, but the fact that it's being smoked or injected is giving you 100% of the cocaine to the brain just like that. And that's why, it's not that it's a different drug, the method of administration gives it a much more addictive potential. Because instead of getting this high, you're getting this high immediately. You all following that? I think you've all heard of people who shoot combinations of cocaine and heroin. Yes? You've heard of the speedball? Anybody? Anytime you hear of people shooting heroin mixed with cocaine, I'm willing to bet that that person is not a cocaine junkie, but a heroin junkie. Why do you think I say that? Any guesses? Matt?
Well, the cocaine acts as a stimulant, and it's very fast acting, and I think if that was your drug of choice, if that was the experience you wanted to have, mixing it with heroin, which is a depressant,
Yep,
would not make much sense.
It doesn't make much sense. So people who are really cocaine, who have a cocaine preference, usually do not mix the cocaine with heroin. On the other hand, when cocaine is cheap enough, as it happens to be now, heroin addicts, very, very frequently, if they can get cocaine, they'll mix it in with their heroin. Why? Because it hits the brain quicker and they get this incredible rush while they're waiting for, a few seconds later, the heroin high to kick in. You're following that? So what they're doing is they're giving themselves that initial rush, but the real rush that they're after, I mean, it's nice if they can get that, but the real high that they're after is the heroin high. That make sense to y'all? Okay, back over to the PowerPoint. The most common forms that you're going to find cocaine in the United States is cocaine hydrochloride, which is the white powder, crack, and freebase. Freebase is very dangerous. It's people who have too much money and too much time on their hands are the people who freebase, people like Richard Pryor when he was alive. And it's very dangerous because you're working with flammable substances and fire. And think about this, because people binge on cocaine and crack, what they're doing is that they're smoking the freebase while they're making the next batch. And it also includes fire to melt it down. You're following that? To make the freebase? Very, very dangerous. Primary effects. Folks, the effects of cocaine and amphetamines are almost identical, with one big difference. The effects of cocaine only last 15 minutes. And that's a very big difference. The effects are almost identical, so you're going to see some crossover here. Cocaine is a CNS stimulant. It causes short-term euphoria and elevated mood. It causes alertness, but only for 15 minutes. You're following that? Or 10 minutes, depending on if you're shooting it or taking it intranasally. It keeps you awake, decreased fatigue, but only for 15 minutes. It was used historically as a local anesthesia, particularly for nasal surgery. There are many famous people who were very serious cocaine addicts, including Sigmund Freud, among others. The other thing that it does is that it constricts your blood vessels, which is one of the reasons that it is used in nasal surgery. How is it taken? In powder form intranasally. It can be smoked if it's changed chemically away from a hydrochloride. Remember, that's why they have to make it into crack and why they have to, or make it into freebase. Or it can be injected. Injection is probably, I'm going to say, go out on and say, the least common way, because again, most people will not put needles into their arms. But people who have serious cocaine habits and are not averse to needles will do that. Similarly, tolerance, like any other drug, it depends on the dose. It depends on administration, pattern of use, and reinforcement conditions. you do not get tolerance to cocaine in the same way that you get tolerance to the opiates. Is everybody clear about that? It really depends on the pattern, how often you do it, how you administer it. You're more likely to become tolerant if you're injecting or smoking. Cross tolerance to all of the amphetamines, because they work very similarly in the brain. Dependence. This is a hard concept. Can people become dependent? The answer is yes, with chronic use. However, what you don't get with cocaine or the amphetamines is withdrawal syndrome. Let me repeat that. Unlike the CNS depressants where you get full-blown withdrawal syndrome, what you get instead is maybe a little bit of jitteriness. The first thing they do is crash. First thing they do when they're coming down from cocaine or amphetamines is they crash, they go to sleep. Then when they wake up, withdrawal manifests as behavioral depression. So the concept of cocaine dependence, it's a tricky one. You can produce it, particularly when people are taking high doses repeatedly. Thankfully, that is not the typical way the cocaine is used. I know you're going to be surprised to hear this, but most cocaine users are recreational social users. The vast majority. The ones we hear about and the ones that we see in treatment are the ones that are not recreational users, social users. But the vast majority of people who use cocaine do not become physically dependent, nor do they become psychologically dependent. While they're doing the cocaine, they become psychogenically dependent, which is why they have to keep using and using and using the drug, because they think that the brain tricks them into thinking there's not enough there. Because the feeling of high that they got before is not the feeling of high that they have now. Quickly, amphetamines. These are synthetic stimulants that share all of the properties of cocaine with one big difference. They are very, very long-acting. Very long-acting. They are also structurally related to a lot of nasal decongestants. Anything that has ephedrine in it is structurally related to amphetamines. The big difference between cocaine and amphetamines is that cocaine is short-acting, amphetamines are very long-acting. Depending on which one we're talking about, they can act for up to 4 to 6 hours or 8 to 10 hours. So remember I talked to you about the pattern that developed in the 1960s? Sometimes people didn't need sleeping medications. They were taking it for appetite suppression, for diets. And what do these drugs do? They suppress your appetite very well. But when you stop taking them, you haven't changed your eating habits, so your weight comes back. But the big liability is the fact that they are so long-acting. You take one in the morning, and there you're ready to go to sleep, and guess what? You're still buzzing. And therefore you need a barbiturate or a sleeping pill to help you sleep. Then you wake up groggy, you need an amphetamine to wake up, and it becomes a horrible cycle of what is essentially was doctor-prescribed drug abuse. Here's a list of commonly used amphetamines and I would say structurally similar drugs. The most common ones are dextroamphetamine, dexedrine, methamphetamine. That is the most common now because it's made with products you can get over the counter, and people are making this in their cars. They have new methods of making it. Surprisingly, are you surprised to see Ritalin on there? Ritalin isn't a true amphetamine because it doesn't work on the same, it works on dopamine more than the other. Actually, Ritalin is more similar to cocaine because it has a bigger effect on dopamine. But these are drugs that we use on kids with ADD, ADHD. Yes? These are drugs we use with kids with ADD, ADHD. And I'm going to be honest, I think we've been sold a bill of goods because we have been told that these drugs, that the amphetamines have a quote-unquote, you can come back to me now for a minute? We are told that they have, we've been told for years that they have a paradoxical effect. What do you think they mean by that? An unexpected effect, right? Think about this. Why would you give a kid who's hyperactive and all over the place a stimulant? Well, the way that they get away with prescribing that is that they say, well, it's a paradoxical effect. And in fact, we have known since day one it's not paradoxical at all. Anybody who takes an amphetamine or a methamphetamine is going to be able to concentrate better, whether you have ADD or don't have ADD. You're following that? one of the main effects, and let's go back to the PowerPoint now, the primary effects of the amphetamines, they are central nervous system stimulants. They speed everything up. They increase your motor and speech activity. They give you a slight euphoria and elevated mood. Depending on how much you take, the higher the dose you take, the more elevated mood and the more euphoria, which is why we're having such a bad problem right now, particularly with poor and working class white folks. That's who's abusing methamphetamine. Mostly people in rural areas. They're not the only ones abusing it, but if you take a look at the demographics, as opposed to other drugs, this is really a white folks drug, and mostly rural areas. What do these drugs do to everybody? They make you alert. They increase your attention. They increase your focus, which is why they work so well in treating ADD, ADHD. They keep you awake. It's a truck driver's drug. Benzodrine was a truck driver's drug in the 60s. And they decrease your fatigue. So truck drivers could take these drugs to drive long distances. We still give these to fighter pilots in the service to keep them awake and to keep them alert. And the other effect it has is a loss of appetite. Not very good for dieting because you don't change, it simply kills your appetite, but it doesn't change the way you eat. So you stop taking the pills and you haven't changed the way you eat and you gain the weight back. Does that make sense to y'all? Again, cocaine does the same thing, but it only decreases your appetite for 15 minutes. Cocaine keeps you awake, but only for 15 minutes until you re-administer. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I'm just wondering about I guess you're probably going to get to that, just the level of addictiveness. Is it, if it's distinct, like for say stuff like Ritalin and Adderall as compared to amphetamines as compared to like cocaine?
Okay, remember we said dose counts? What they have done is that they have gone back. I'm not going to say, let's go back one slide. A lot of the drugs that were prescribed in the 1960s no longer are on the market. Some of them are. Obviously, dextroamphetamine still is. We still have a drug called disoxin that's used for ADD, ADHD, which is a methamphetamine. So it's still legally prescribed. What they have done instead is they've moved to these other drugs like Adderall, and Cylert, attenuate dose band, ionomin. These are structurally similar. They do not last as long. You have to take them every 4 to 6 hours as opposed to every 8 hours, and they're not as strong. Did that answer your question or not? Yeah.
Well, it does, but I'm like, for example, I've worked with kids who are on really high doses of Adderall. I mean, they might start off low, and then it's like they just keep stepping up.
Because you become tolerant to it.
I mean, tolerant and presumably addicted? Maybe? I mean, I don't know.
Remember, we're not going to use the term addicted. Addiction is
physically
a pattern
dependent.
of drugs.
Physically dependent. And the reason I ask that is like you have such young kids taking this sometimes like 4 or 5 year olds, and they're on it for 10 years.
But their dose is regulated. They're being followed by a doctor. What they have found is that these kids do not necessarily become drug addicts. Because the kids are not out there seeking the high. They're seeking the medical effects of the drugs. Does that make sense? These kids are not trying to get high. Now, these drugs do have some effects. One of the things that these drugs do is that when taken by young children, they stunt their growth until they get off the drug. So that's one of the things the drugs do. But there's been, I think, fairly sufficient research on this that really suggests that kids do not become addicted to these drugs, but rather when they're prescribed properly and used properly. Yes, tolerance is simply it's simply a function of the drug. It's not a function of addiction necessarily. It's what the drug does. Now, can people become dependent? The answer is yes, but it takes really high doses. The way in which it's prescribed by doctors, it's rare to find dependence. That make sense? Okay. Administration. These drugs are taken orally, injected, intranasally, and inhaled by smoking. Quickest route to the brain, smoking. Tolerance, again, it depends on the dose, it depends on the pattern of administration and the pattern of use. And let's go back to tolerance. You can become tolerant to some effects. The appetite suppression, you become tolerant to that quickly. So what happens is that people take higher and higher doses if they're taking this to diet, and they get all of the other effects that they're not necessarily looking for. Tolerance to the other effects may be minimal or non-existent. So tolerance, for example, to the thing that makes you focus is not as significant. Cross-tolerance, obviously, to cocaine. Physical dependence, again, with high-dose chronic use. And here we're not talking about doses that are necessarily prescribed. Now, here's the thing about physical dependence. The thing about physical dependence is that it's going to be really hard to talk about physical dependence in the same way that we do with the CNS depressants. Because what you see when people stop taking amphetamines, when people stop taking cocaine, they sleep. As a general rule, and we'll talk more about this in the future, as a general rule, withdrawal from a drug is the opposite of what the drug does. Let me say that again. As a general rule, withdrawal from a drug is the opposite of what the drug does. And therefore, what we get, if it's a drug that makes you go to sleep, when you start withdrawing from it, what happens? You get insomnia. If it's a drug that keeps you awake and you're withdrawing from it, what happens? You go to sleep. If it's a drug that's used to kill pain and you're withdrawing from it, what happens? You feel pain. You all following that? So when we talk about physical dependence, can it happen? The answer is yes, and where we see it is with high-dose chronic use. We do not see physical dependence to the same extent when people are taking it as medically prescribed. Even if the doctors have to up the dose because of tolerance, we're still not talking about the chronic high-dose use that we see in people who are abusing the drugs. We're not going to get through all the drugs today, so I'm going to have to pick this up in a different lecture. Let me ask Don, how much more time do I have to tape? I can't see. 6? Do you want me to try to finish most of this today? Let's try to finish most of this today and we can come back and talk about this. Marijuana. Marijuana is a very unusual drug, extremely unusual, because it has more subjective effects than most other drugs. And in fact, most of the effects of marijuana are in fact very subjective. It's a product that comes from a hemp plant. Unlike cocaine, which can only be grown in high mountainous regions in certain parts of South America, marijuana can be grown in your closet, and often is. It can be grown anywhere in any climate. Well, and that's part of the reason why it's so hard to regulate it. The main compound in it is THC, the compound that gets you high. And the most common forms you find here in the United States are the actual marijuana as a plant. You sometimes see it as sinsemilla, that means marijuana without seeds. Or you see it as hashish, which is like a brown, sticky substance that gets smoked. Primary effects of marijuana. It doesn't make you into a killer, and it doesn't lead you into heroin. Primary effects are mild sedation. It makes you slightly drowsy. We now know that it's also good for pain relief. It doesn't kill pain the way that the opiates do, but it has some action on the pain receptors so that it actually does produce pain relief. And particularly it's good for neuropathic pain, but it's good for other pain as well. Does it create euphoria? Yes, but it's a mild euphoria that's more or less like 1 or 2 drinks. In very high doses, this is not the dose that you're going to find out on the street. You can also cause hallucinations. But this is not the street pot that the person down the block is buying. What it does physically, it increases your pulse and your heart rate. It reddens your eyes. These are common effects for everybody. You smoke marijuana, you're going to have increased pulse and heart rate. You're going to have reddening of the eyes, you're going to have dryness of the mouth. Unlike nicotine, which is the bronchoconstrictor, marijuana is a bronchodilator. Very different effect. It also has very varied subjective psychological effects. Researchers have found, ready for this, over 200 different subjective effects. What that means, plain and simply, back over to me, John. What that means, plain and simply, is that all of us in here could be smoking the same marijuana, same amount, and you might get the munchies, Sarah. Freddie, you might not. Matt, you might start to feel creative. Eric, you might feel just drowsy. You're following that? The psychological effects are so diverse that it doesn't affect everybody the same way. It simply doesn't. And the euphoria is relatively mild. So a lot of what we have been told about marijuana and the attempts to demonize it are simply untrue. There's a lot of propaganda. But that does not mean, and I want to go on record as saying this, that doesn't mean that it's without liability. All drugs have certain liability. Are we clear about that? And marijuana is no different. Marijuana has some liabilities. Yeah, Matt.
The subjectivity of it, I mean, just sounds a lot like the hallucinogens, actually.
Yes.
In terms of being able to ingest it, and it's like the experience being very different,
Absolutely.
dependent on the person.
Except that the hallucinogens have you out here in the stratosphere, and marijuana has you mildly relaxed. Well, which is why rats won't self-administer it. Again, the hallucinations or the other feelings that it produces. Back to the PowerPoint. How do people use marijuana? They smoke it, or they can take it orally. Who was it that asked me earlier about oral? The problem with taking using marijuana orally is that when people smoke marijuana, cigarettes or joints, you can self-titrate how much you're getting. Because remember, smoke hits the brain really quickly. So if you're getting too much, you simply put the marijuana cigarette down. If you ingest it orally in brownies, for example, once it hits you, if you've taken too much, you're stuck with that. You cannot adjust the dose. They do make oral pills of marijuana that are not particularly effective. You're following that? Tolerance, extremely rare. Where you find tolerance is only with people who smoke every day, all of the day, repeated high doses. And in fact, some people have shown reverse tolerance. Got 55 seconds left. Cross tolerance, none found in humans. Unlikely. There is no such thing as physical dependence on marijuana, despite the propaganda that you hear. We have now recently discovered a THC antagonist. We will talk more in the future about marijuana and what some of the problems are. The biggest problem with marijuana is that it affects memory. It affects the ability to remember things while you're high. It affects reaction time. You can read more in the Kuhn book about this. It affects reaction time. But by and large, marijuana does not make people these violent criminals. If anything, it makes you drowsy. But it is not without liability. Any questions? Okay, we're going to cover the rest of the drugs the next time I do my lecture. I'm going to put the PowerPoint up so you will see about the psychedelic drugs. Okay, thank you.